Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most brutal winters London has ever endured, the Great Frost of 1604. Picture this. You open your eyes in a cramped Southwark lodging, and your breath doesn't just mist, it crystallizes in the air like tiny diamonds before your face. The chamber pot beside your straw mattress has frozen into a solid block of ice. Outside, the mighty Thames isn't flowing. It's not even moving. It's a vast, silent plain of ice stretching from bank to bank, and honestly, you probably won't survive this winter if you're poor, elderly, or unlucky. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing where in the world you're listening from as you drift off. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake to darkness. That's normal for December in London. The sun won't bother rising until nearly 8 o'clock, and even then it's more of a grudging suggestion than actual daylight. But something feels different this morning. Wrong. Your nose burns with each breath, and when you exhale, you can actually hear a faint crackling sound as moisture freezes in the air before your face. You reach for the woolen blanket you pulled up to your chin last night, but your fingers are so stiff they barely respond. The blanket itself has gone rigid in places where your breath condensed and froze during the night. You're essentially sealed under a textile ice sheet. So charming. Sitting up takes genuine effort. Your joints protest, and not in the usual 17th century, I'm probably getting scurvy way. This is different. The cold has seeped into your bones and you realize with creeping dread that you never actually got warm last night. Not once. You shivered through the entire night in that twilight state between sleep and hypothermia. The room you're renting in room is generous for what's essentially a corner of someone's attic in Southwark. Looks like a scene from some winter hellscape. Frost has crept across the inside of the walls in elaborate fractal patterns. Your boots, which you left by the pathetic remains of last night's coal fire, are frozen solid. You could probably use them as weapons at this point, but it's the chamber pot that really drives home how catastrophically cold it is. You kept it under the bed for, well, obvious nighttime convenience. The contents have frozen completely. Not a slushy, semi-frozen mess. We're talking solid ice right to the bottom. Historians still argue whether the winter of 1683-84 was the coldest in the entire millennium. But standing here in your frozen attic, academic debates feel somewhat irrelevant. You're living inside a natural icebox. You shuffle to the tiny window, more of a hole with some oiled cloth stretched across it, and peer outside. The cloth has frozen stiff, so you have to crack it away from the frame. What you see stops your breath, and not just because you're already borderline hypothermic. Southwark stretches before you in monochrome. Every surface wears thick frost like a second skin. The thatched roofs look like they've been dusted with powdered sugar, except this sugar could slice your hand open. Icicles spropper, dagger-sized one shang from every eave, some of them 3 feet long. You watch one break free from the butcher's shop across the way and shatter on the frozen mud below with a sound like breaking glass. But it's the Thames that captures your attention and refuses to let go. You can see it from here just a few streets away, and it's not moving at all. The greatest river in England, the liquid highway that makes London possible, has simply stopped. Grey-white ice stretches from the Southwark bank all the way across to the city, maybe 200 yards of frozen water. Here and there you can see the dark masts of wherries and small boats locked in place like toys in a child's abandoned game. A church bell tolls somewhere. Stfut. Saviours, probably, and the sound carries with unnatural clarity through the frigid air. Cold air is denser. You'll learn years later, which means sound travels differently. But right now, all you know is that the bell sounds wrong. Sharper. More brittle. Like the air itself might shatter if the bell ringer gets too enthusiastic. You need to move, need to get warm, need to figure out how to survive a day that's starting with ice forming inside your lodgings. The coal scuttle in the corner holds maybe 3 small pieces of koala luxury that cost you a week's wages, and that was before whatever fresh hell this winter is planning. You've got maybe enough to take the edge off the cold for an hour. 2, if you're miserly about it. Your landlady, old Meg, she's probably 35 but looks 60 because, well, it's the 1680s and existence is aging, shouts up the stairs that if you want breakfast, you'd better get down before her husband eats your portion. Breakfast is a generous term for what you're about to receive, likely some barley bread and maybe, if fortune smiles, a scraping of butter that's probably been sitting in the same dish since Charles II's coronation. You pull on your frozen boots, a process that involves genuine violence against your own feet and wrap your cloak around your shoulders. The fabric is stiff with cold. Everything is stiff with cold. You're stiff with cold. If you had a diary, today's entry would just be the word cold, written 200 times. As you descend the creaking stairs, you catch snippets of conversation from the main room. Meg's husband, Tom, is holding forth to anyone who'll listen about how he remembers a cold snap in 58. But this is summit different. This is. A couple of other lodgers huddle near the hearth, which contains the saddest fire you've ever seen, less of a blaze and more of a theoretical suggestion of warmth. Thames is locked, someone mutters. Right across. Saw it myself. Can't be, another voice argues. Too wide, too fast. Ice it never hold, but you know it has. You've seen it with your own eyes. And as you step toward that miserable excuse for a fire, trying to get some feeling back into your fingers, you realize that everything in London is about to change. The river isn't just frozen, it's dead. And with it, so is the city's lifeline for food, coal, goods, everything that keeps 500,000 souls alive in this sprawling, filthy, magnificent mess of a city. Welcome to the Great Frost of 1684. You're going to wish you'd packed warmer clothes. The Thames didn't freeze overnight, though standing in Meg's pathetic excuse for a common room, it feels like it must have. But you've been watching the river for days now, and the truth is somehow worse than a sudden transformation. You witnessed the slow death of Europe's busiest waterway, and it was like watching someone you love waste away from fever incremental, inexorable, and deeply unsettling. 5 days ago, on the 20th of December, you noticed the first ice floes drifting downstream. Not unusual for winter, really. Most years, you'd see some ice forming along the quieter edges, in the little inlets where the current couldn't quite reach. Watermen would complain about it making their boats harder to maneuver, and that would be that. But these floes were different, thicker, more numerous, jostling against each other like sheep crowding through a gate. You stood on London Bridge that morning because of course you did. Everyone congregates on the bridge when something's happening on the river end. Watch the ice accumulate. The bridge itself is part of the problem, you realize. Those 19 stone arches, with their massive starlings jutting out into the current, create a bottleneck. Water rushes through the narrow gaps with tremendous force during normal times. During the Great Frost, the ice starts piling up against those starlings like debris against a dam. By the second day, the floes had grown from dinner plate size to some the size of carts. You could hear them grinding against each other, a low groaning sound that echoed off the buildings lining both banks. Watermen were still trying to work, poling their wherries through the increasingly choked channels, but you could see the panic in their faces. These men have lived their entire lives on the Thames. Their fathers and grandfathers worked the river, and they've never seen anything like this. A quirky little detail that won't make it into most history books. On the third day, a particularly enterprising waterman named Jackie Stokes tried to charge people a penny to watch him smash through the ice floes with his wherry. Just ram right through them, showing off how tough he was, how the Thames couldn't be tamed. You paid your penny entertainment is scarce in December and watched him make it about 20 yards before a floe the size of a cow caught his boat amidships and nearly capsized him. He managed to pole back to shore, soaking wet and considerably humbler. The crowd, predictably, found this hilarious. Nothing bonds Londoners quite like watching someone else's hubris get checked. By day 4, the river had slowed to a crawl. The current was still there. You could tell by the way the ice moved, sluggish and reluctant, but it was losing the fight. Ice formed not just at the edges now, but across the entire width of the river in patches. You could map the battle in real time. Here, the current still held, water dark and churning between white plates of ice. There, the cold had won, and the surface lay still and pale. The watermen had given up entirely by this point. Their boats sat pulled up on the banks, useless. These men, who've spent every day of their lives ferrying people and goods across the Thames, could only stand and watch their livelihood freeze solid. Some of them wept openly. Others just stared, faces blank with shock. You overheard one old waterman, must have been 70 if he was a day, muttering that he'd worked the river since he was 6 years old and never seen it stop. "She'll start again," he kept saying. "She always starts again." But she didn't. On the 5th day, Christmas Day, ironically, though nobody felt particularly festive, the Thames locked completely. You weren't there for the exact moment, of course. You were huddled in St. Saviour's Church, trying to absorb some warmth from the bodies packed around you and half listening to a sermon about trials and tribulations, very on brand for the day. But when you emerged into the pale afternoon light, someone was shouting that the river had gone solid all the way across. You pushed your way through the crowd gathering on the Southwark bank, and there it was, a continuous sheet of ice stretching from your side to the city. No gaps, no dark water shelling through, just white and grey ice, slightly rippled like a bedsheet that hasn't been smoothed properly, disappearing under London Bridge and extending as far as you could see downriver. The silence is what gets you. The Thames is never silent. Even in the dead of night you can hear it. The lap of water against the banks, the creak of boats at anchor, the occasional splash of something falling or jumping in. London's heartbeat, someone once called it, and you never really understood what they meant until now, standing here listening to nothing. The river has no pulse. London's heartbeat has stopped. Historians still argue whether the ice was thick enough to walk on from the very first day it locked, or whether it took another week of freezing temperatures to make it truly safe. What's not in debate is how it felt to watch it happen. You witnessed the impossible becoming real, degree by degree, hour by hour. The Thames, which has flowed for thousands of years, which existed before London, which carved this valley and made this city possible, simply stopped. People around you are crying, praying, arguing about what it means. Some swear it's the end. Times the Thames freezing is clearly one of the signs of the apocalypse, never mind that it's not actually mentioned in Revelation anywhere. Others are more practical, already calculating how this affects their business, their livelihood, their ability to eat tomorrow. You just stand there, watching the ice. Somewhere beneath that frozen surface, there are fish, locked in place, dead, fled downriver to the estuary where the salt water and current might still be moving. You'll never know. What you do know is that everything has changed. London without the Thames is like a body without blood. You're about to find out what happens when the city's circulation stops. And honestly, it's not going to be pretty. The first person to step onto the frozen Thames does so on the morning of December 26th, and you're there to witness it because, frankly, there's not much else to do. Work has ground to a halt. No boats means no cargo means no loading means no wages for half of Suffolk. So you're standing on the bank with about 200 other suddenly unemployed Londoners, staring at the ice and wondering if anyone's stupid enough to actually walk on it. Enter Thomas Wickham, a coal porter who's apparently decided that having steady employment for the past 20 years has made him boring. Thomas is built like a brick privy broad, squat and seemingly indestructible, which probably contributes to his confidence as he approaches the ice's edge. He's also, you notice, significantly drunk. It's barely past 9 in the morning, but Thomas has clearly decided that Dutch courage is the best kind of courage when you're about to do something monumentally idiotic. Right then, Thomas announces to no one in particular, though the crowd has gone quiet enough to hear him, "Let's see if she holds." He places one boot on the ice, pauses, shifts his weight slightly. The ice doesn't crack, doesn't groan, doesn't do anything dramatic. Emboldened, Thomas brings his other foot onto the frozen surface. He's standing on the Thames now, 2 feet from the bank, and you can see the exact moment it hits him what he's doing. His face goes through a fascinating journey from bravado to terror to something like religious awe. "She's solid," he shouts, and the crowd erupts. Half of them are cheering, the other half are shouting that he's a fool and to get back before he drowns, and Thomas Bliss, his drunk, confident heart, takes another step. Then another. He's 5 yards from the bank now, walking like a man crossing a frozen pond in January, which is exactly what he's doing, except this pond is the busiest shipping channel in England. You watch, heart hammering, as Thomas ventures 10 yards out, 15, 20. At 30 yards, he stops, turns around, and waves like he's just climbed a mountain. The crowd has grown to maybe 400 people now, all of them screaming encouragement or dire warnings depending on their temperament. Someone throws a rock that skitters across the ice near Thomas's feet, proving absolutely nothing except that Londoners will throw rocks at anything given the opportunity. Here's where it gets interesting. A woman you'll later learn her name was Margaret Dodd, a fishwife from Billingsgate decides that if Thomas can do it, so can she. Margaret is considerably smaller than Thomas, which she apparently interprets as an advantage. "I'll barely press on it at all," she reasons to the crowd, as if ice evaluates weight applications like a particularly discerning landlord. Margaret steps onto the ice in her wooden pattens, those raised platform overshoes that keep your actual shoes out of the London street muck. Historians still argue whether pattens distributed weight better than regular boots on ice, or whether the wooden soles were actually more dangerous because they couldn't grip properly. You're about to get a real-time demonstration of this debate. She makes it 3 steps before her feet shoot out from under her in perfect synchronization, and she lands flat on her back with a sound like someone dropping a sack of turnips. The crowd gasps. Margaret lies still for a horrible moment, and you think, well, that's it. Someone's died on the ice already, and it's been less than an hour, but... Then she sits up, laughs, and waves. "Slippery," she announces, as if this is breaking news. Within an hour, the ice near the Suffolk Bank looks like the world's most dangerous dance floor. Dozens of people are venturing onto the frozen Thames, most of them taking tiny, shuffling steps like elderly people on cobblestones. Some crawl on their hands and knees, which looks ridiculous but is probably smarter than walking upright. A few enterprising souls have brought walking sticks to test the ice ahead of them, tapping it like they're checking for hollow spots, which, fun fact, that won't be understood for another couple centuries, is actually pretty useless because ice strength has more to do with temperature and thickness than whether it sounds solid when you poke it. The ice walkers develop a sort of unofficial ranking system. Getting 10 yards from shore? That's beginner territory, nothing special. 20 yards? Respectable. 30? You're getting confident, maybe overconfident. One young apprentice, couldn't be more than 14, makes it almost to the middle of the river before his nerve breaks and he comes scurrying back, practically on all fours, absolutely convinced he heard cracking beneath his feet. Did he? Who knows? But his terror is real enough that it stops the advance for a good 10 minutes while everyone reassesses their life choices. You notice that nobody's trying to cross completely to the other side yet. There's a difference between walking on the ice and actually using it as a bridge. That feels like tempting fate in a way that even drunk Thomas isn't ready for. The middle of the river, where the current was strongest, where the water was deepest, that ice might be younger, thinner, angrier. Better to stay near the edges for now. A quirky detail that some pamphleteer will record later, a dog named Bess becomes the first animal to cross the frozen Thames. Her owner, trying to call her back from the Southwark side, watches in horror as Bess simply trots across the ice like it's a particularly slippery floor, makes it to the city side, and barks triumphantly. The dog has accomplished in 2 minutes what no human has dared attempt. Bess becomes briefly famous, and her owner will spend the next week charging people a penny to meet the dog what crossed the Thames. Never underestimate London's appetite for novelty. By afternoon, emboldened by Bess's success and probably by several more rounds of Dutch courage, a handful of people do attempt the full crossing. Most of them make it. One merchant, carrying a heavy pack of goods he's trying to deliver since the wherries aren't running, makes it 3/4 of the way across before the weight becomes too much. He doesn't fall through the ice, is genuinely solid by this point, but he does collapse from exhaustion and has to be helped the rest of the way by some amused apprentices who've been following his progress like it's a sporting event. You don't walk on the ice yourself? Not yet. You're not sure if that makes you smart or cowardly, and you're not sure the difference matters. What you are sure of is that something fundamental has shifted. 24 hours ago, the Thames was an uncrossable boundary. Now it's a path. The laws of nature, or at least the laws as you understood them, have been revised. If the river can become land, what else might change before this winter ends? By the morning of December 28th, you realize that the novelty of walking on the frozen Thames is about to be replaced by a much less entertaining crisis. You're running out of food. Specifically, you're running out of bread, which is a problem because bread isn't just food in 1684. Londonite's basically edible currency. You measure your survival in loaves. The issue, you're learning as you stand in a growing crowd outside Hodges' Bakery on Long Lane, is that London doesn't grow its own grain. Shocking, right? It turns out that cramming 500,000 people into a few square miles of buildings doesn't leave much room for wheat fields. Instead, London imports everything. Grain comes down from the Midlands via river, flour arrives from mills upstream, even the fuel to bake the stuff travels by water. Or rather, it did, past tense. Because right now, the Thames is a frozen highway to nowhere, and every barge full of flour is stuck somewhere upriver, locked in ice, doing absolutely no one any good. Hodges' Bakery, normally a reliable if uninspiring source of barley bread and the occasional wheat loaf if you've got the coin, has a sign on the door that simply reads, "No flour, no bread. Tomorrow maybe, tomorrow maybe." That's the most terrifying thing you've read since the plague notices in 65. The crowd around you is maybe 30 people strong and growing angrier by the minute. You recognize most of them. There's Anne from the laundry, Jack who works at the tannery, Margaret Dodd who fell on the ice yesterday and is apparently none the worse for it. These are your neighbours, people you see every day, and they're starting to look at Hodges' locked door the way hungry dogs look at a meat pie. "He's holding back," someone shouts. "Got loaves in there for them. What can pay extra?" You're not sure that's true. Hodge seems like an honest enough sort as bakers go, which admittedly isn't saying much since bakers have ranked somewhere between tax collectors and plague rats in London's trust hierarchy since forever. But the accusation catches fire anyway because hungry people don't need truth. They need someone to blame. The crowd surges forward, and suddenly you're pressed against Hodges' door whether you want to be or not. Yeah. Someone's elbow is in your ribs. Someone else's boot comes down on your foot. The smell of unwashed bodies in winter wool is overwhelming, which is saying something because you've lived in Southwark long enough that you thought you were immune to bad smells. Turns out desperation has its own particular stench. Bread, bread, bread. The chant starts somewhere behind you and spreads through the crowd like fire through tinder. It's not clever, but it's effective. The entire mob is now rhythmically demanding bread from a locked door, which would be funny if you weren't genuinely worried you might starve this winter. Hodge, to his credit, or perhaps his foolishness, opens an upper window and sticks his flour-dusted head out. Big mistake. The crowd roars like they've spotted prey. "I've got nothing," he shouts down. The flour barges are stuck at Westminster. "Can't get through to the mills at all." "Liar," someone screams, and a stone flies past Hodges' head, close enough that he jerks back inside and slams the shutters. The crowd surges again, and you're genuinely concerned now that you're about to participate in your first bread riot, which is not how you plan to spend your Thursday. Here's a fun historical fact that definitely doesn't feel fun right now. London consumed about 11,000 sacks of flour per week in the 1680s. That's roughly 1.5 pounds of bread per person per day, which means the city needs a constant, uninterrupted flow of grain to avoid catastrophe. And constant, uninterrupted flow is precisely what a frozen Thames cannot provide. You're watching the math play out in real time, and the equation doesn't balance. A woman next to you starts crying. Not dramatic sobbing, just quiet tears running down her windburned cheeks. She's holding a child, maybe 3 years old, and the child is asking for bread in that persistent, uncomprehending way that small children have. "Soon," the woman keeps saying. "Soon, love, soon." But her eyes tell a different story. The constable arrives before the crowd can actually break down Hodge's door, which is good for Hodge but doesn't solve your bread problem. The constabulary fat man named Perkins, who's usually half asleep on the job, looks genuinely terrified at the size of the crowd. He's got 2 watchmen with him, both armed with staves, but that's not nearly enough to intimidate 30 hungry Londoners. "Disperse!" Perkins shouts, his voice cracking slightly. "In the King's name, disperse!" Nobody moves. You're all doing silent calculations. Is bread worth a beating? Is it worth a rest? At what point does survival outweigh consequences? Historians still argue whether the authorities lost control of London during the Great Frost or whether it just felt that way because everyone was so desperate. What's not in debate is that the normal social order started cracking like, well, ice under pressure. When people can't eat, rules start to seem negotiable. "There's bread at St. Olave's," someone shouts. "The church is distributing to the poor." The crowd pivots as one organism and streams toward the church, leaving Perkins standing outside Hodge's door looking relieved and confused. You go with them because what else are you going to do? Stay here and stare at a locked bakery? St. Olave's church is already mobbed when you arrive. Apparently, word travels fast when there's food involved. A harried-looking priest is trying to organize some kind of orderly distribution, but it's chaos. People are pushing, shoving, arguing about who got here first and who deserves more. You spot a well-dressed merchant's wife trying to claim a loaf, and the crowd literally hisses at her. The class warfare is usually more subtle in London, hidden behind manners and hierarchy, but hunger strips away pretense. You manage to get a small loaf, maybe half the size of what you'd normally buy from Hodge. It's dark rye, heavy and sour, the kind of bread that tells you it's made from the bottom of the flour barrel, the kind of bread you'd normally feed to pigs. But right now, clutched against your chest like it's made of gold, it feels like salvation. The priest is saying something about Christian charity and sharing, but his words are drowned out by the crowd's demands. Someone near the back is shouting that the church must have more, that they're holding back for the wealthy parishioners. The priest's face goes through several interesting colour changes before he retreats inside and bars the door. Smart man. You head back toward your lodgings, that pathetic loaf tucked under your cloak where nobody can see it, and get ideas. Other people are doing the same. Everyone's hiding their bread like contraband. The walk that normally takes 5 minutes stretches to 15 because you're taking back alleys, avoiding crowds, basically treating a loaf of bread like stolen treasure. When you finally get back to Meg's, you cut the loaf into 8 pieces and try to calculate how long you can make it last. 2 days? 3 if you're careful. And then what? The Thames is still frozen. The barges are still stuck. The mills can't ship flour. This isn't a problem that's going to resolve itself tomorrow or next week or possibly even next month. You eat 1 piece of the bread slowly, making it last. It tastes like desperation and sawdust, but it fills the hollow in your stomach, at least temporarily. Tomorrow, you'll have to figure out where the next meal comes from. Tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, stretching into a frozen future where the simple act of eating becomes a daily battle. Welcome to January in the Great Frost. The fun's just beginning. If the bread shortage is making you nervous, the coal situation is about to make you genuinely terrified, because it turns out that staying alive in a London winter requires 2 things: food in your stomach and fire in your hearth. You're already running low on the first, and as you huddle in your corner of Meg's freezing attic on the morning of December 30th, you're discovering that the second has become impossible. The coal scuttle in the corner, that pathetic little bucket that usually holds maybe a week's worth of fuel if your frugal is empty. Completely, utterly, mockingly empty. You tip it upside down just to confirm what you already know, and a few black flakes of coal dust drift out like the world's saddest snow. Here's something you probably never thought about before this winter. London doesn't mine coal. Not a single lump. The city sits on clay and gravel, neither of which burn particularly well, though you're going to try anyway before this is over. Instead, London's coal comes from Newcastle, shipped down the coast in massive collier vessels that hold hundreds of tons of the stuff. It's a brilliant system. Really, Newcastle has coal coming out of its ears, London has money and a desperate need for warmth, and the North Sea conveniently connects them. Or it did, until the North Sea decided to freeze solid from the Thames estuary all the way up the coast. You learned about the colliers being stuck from Tom, your landlord, who heard it from a sailor, who heard it from a merchant, who probably heard it from someone's cousin's friend. Information in London travels like disease, unreliable, mutating, but generally pointing towards some underlying truth. And the truth is this: there are approximately 40 coal ships trapped in ice somewhere between here and Newcastle, carrying enough coal to keep London warm for weeks, and all of it might as well be on the moon for all the good it's doing you. The previous night, you burned your last 3 pieces of coal and watched them glow with something approaching religious devotion. Coal, when it burns properly, produces a steady, radiant heat that can actually warm a room. It's expensive. Sure, those 3 lumps cost you nearly a day's wages, but it's worth it when the alternative is freezing to death in your sleep. Except now, there is no more coal at any price, and the alternative is looking increasingly likely. Meg has announced that the common room fire will be lit only in the evenings, and only for 2 hours, and only if everyone contributes fuel. Fuel, at this point, is a generous term for what people are bringing. Yesterday, someone contributed a broken chair. The day before, a pile of wood scraps that looked suspiciously like someone's floorboards. This morning, you watch old Meg herself feed a wooden spoon into the flames, and you realize things have progressed beyond desperate into some new category of survival that doesn't have a name yet. You look around your corner of the attic, trying to decide what you can burn. There's not much to choose from. Your bed is a straw mattress on a wooden frame. The frame could burn, but then you'd be sleeping on the floor, which in a London winter is essentially volunteering for hypothermia. There's a small stool you use as a table, a trunk containing your worldly possessions, and, that's it. That's everything you own that's made of wood. The stool is the obvious choice. You don't actually need a table. You can eat standing up, or sitting on the floor, or while pacing back and forth because movement generates heat. But looking at that stool, which has served you faithfully for 3 years, which cost you a solid week's wages when you bought it, you feel a strange reluctance. Burning your furniture feels like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that this winter has reduced you from a functional adult to someone who has to destroy their own possessions to survive. You burn the stool anyway. Pride doesn't keep you warm. The wood is dry, at least, which means it catches quickly when you feed it into Meg's pathetic common room fire that evening. It burns fast, 2 gone in maybe 40 minutes, providing a brief surge of heat that feels glorious until you remember that you've just eliminated a piece of furniture for less than an hour of warmth. The mathematics of survival are brutally unfavourable. A quirky detail that will show up in pamphlets later: someone in Cheapside got so desperate for fuel that they tried burning books. Not just any books, an entire collection of sermons that had belonged to their late father. The books burned technically, but printed paper produces more smoke than heat, and the result was a room full of choking fumes and several partially charred sermons on the floor. The irony of burning religious text during what many were calling God's judgment was lost on precisely no one. You're not burning books yet, mostly because you don't own any. Books are for people with money and education, neither of which apply to you. But you are eyeing your trunk with increasing speculation. It's solid oak, which would burn beautifully. The problem is that it contains everything you own: your spare shirt, your other pair of hose, the leather pouch with your small collection of coins, a few personal items that have no monetary value but matter to you anyway. If you burn the trunk, where do these things go? Historians still argue whether the fuel shortage or the food shortage was worse during the Great Frost. It's an academic debate that misses the point. Both shortages were catastrophic, and they fed into each other in horrible ways. Can't get warm enough to sleep? You're exhausted all the time. Exhausted all the time? You make poor decisions about food. No food? You generate less body heat. Less body heat. You need more external warmth. It's a spiral, and you're caught in it. The wealthy, of course, aren't burning their furniture. You know this because you can see the smoke from their chimney's thick, dark smoke that speaks of proper coal fires, or at least good seasoned wood, not the desperate combination of furniture fragments and hope that the poor are burning. The merchants, the lawyers, the people who had the foresight and capital to stockpile coal before the freeze, they're sitting in warm rooms right now, probably complaining about how chilly it is compared to usual. Meanwhile, you're contemplating whether your wooden trunk or your bed frame will provide more BTUs per pound. You choose neither, at least for tonight. Instead, you volunteer your stool's Matea, smaller stool you'd forgotten about, tucked under the eaves, and earn yourself another hour near Meg's fire. It's not enough. It's never enough. But it's something, and in the Great Frost, something is the difference between survival and becoming another frozen corpse that won't be discovered until the thaw. That night, back in your attic corner, you can see your breath again. You've wrapped yourself in every piece of fabric you own, your cloak, your spare shirt worn over your regular shirt, even a burlap sack you found that makes you look ridiculous but traps a tiny bit of warmth. You're shivering so hard your teeth are chattering. An involuntary rhythm that would be annoying if it weren't so concerning. Shivering is your body's last-ditch effort to generate heat. When you stop shivering, that's when you're really in trouble. Outside, the frost continues its relentless work. Ice creeps across the inside of your walls in patterns that would be beautiful if they weren't terrifying. The Thames remains locked, the coal ships remain stuck, and London's fuel supply dwindles by the hour. Tomorrow, you'll probably burn the trunk, or the bed frame, or maybe both, in a final desperate gesture toward warmth before you freeze to death in a city of 500,000 souls, all of you locked in the same losing battle against winter. The funny thing is, you used to complain about how expensive coal was. Back in November, when 3 lumps cost a day's wages, you thought that was extortion. Now you'd pay a week's wages for a single lump. A month's wages. Whatever it takes, but money is useless when there's nothing to buy, and right now, coal might as well be diamonds for all the good wishing for it does. You pull the burlap sack tighter and try to sleep. Tomorrow's problem can wait until tomorrow. Tonight, you just need to make it to morning without freezing. The morning of January 1st, 1685, you wake up thirsty. Not the normal, I could use a drink, thirsty, but the kind of bone-deep thirst that makes your tongue feel like a piece of old leather and your throat click when you swallow. You reach for the water jug you keep beside your bed, or rather, beside your straw mattress on the floor, since you burned the bed frame 2 days ago in a moment of desperation that seemed smart at the time and foolish in retrospect. The jug is frozen solid, not just a skim of ice on top that you could break through with your finger. The entire contents have transformed into a single block of ice that won't budge even when you tip the jug upside down and shake it like you're trying to murder it. You've essentially got a ceramic jug with an ice sculpture inside, which would be artistic if it weren't potentially fatal. Or you need water. Humans can survive weeks without food. It'll be miserable. You'll lose weight. You probably can't afford to lose, but you'll live. Without water, 3 days, maybe 4 if you're lucky and don't exert yourself. And you've just discovered that every drop of water in your immediate vicinity has decided to become a solid. You descend to the common room where Meg is already awake, attempting to chip ice out of her own water bucket with a kitchen knife. The bucket sits by what used to be the hearth, which has no fire this morning because, surprise, there's no fuel. The frozen water inside the bucket is at least an inch thick, and Meg's making about as much progress as someone trying to dig through oak with a spoon. "Conduit's frozen," she announces without looking up. "Checked it an hour ago. Solid." The conduit she's referring to is one of London's public water sources, a fountain fed by pipes that bring relatively clean water from springs outside the city. Or they did, until the pipes froze sometime during the night and cut off the flow entirely. London has several of these conduits scattered throughout the city, and by mid-morning you'll learn that every single one of them has frozen solid. 500,000 people, and the taps have just been turned off. Your options for obtaining water are now melt snow, melt ice from the river, or buy water from someone who's already done one of those things and is charging whatever the market will bear. None of these options are particularly appealing. Melting snow sounds simple enough until you actually try it. You head outside with a large pot borrowed from Meg, who warned you that if you lose or damage her pot, she'll murder you in your sleep. Fair enough. The snow is piled everywhere against buildings, in drifts across the streets, heaped in corners where the wind has pushed it. It looks pristine and clean, which is your first mistake in judgment. You scoop snow into the pot until it's full, which takes maybe 30 seconds. Then you haul it back inside and hold it near the pathetic excuse for a fire that someone has managed to coax from a broken barrel stave and what looks like someone's old boot. The snow begins to melt, which is encouraging, except it's melting very, very slowly. And as it melts, you realize just how much snow you need to produce a useful amount of water. Here's a fun fact that you're learning through painful experience. Snow has a lot of air in it. A pot full of snow melts down to maybe an inch or two of water at the bottom. To get a pot full of actual liquid water, you'd need to collect and melt snow approximately 5 or 6 times. And you'd need to keep the pot warm enough to melt it, which requires fuel, which you don't have. After an hour of this nonsense, you've produced maybe a cup of lukewarm water that tastes faintly of soot and disappointment. 1 cup for an hour's work. This is not a sustainable system. The snow itself isn't even clean. As it melts, you can see sediment settling at the bottom ash from London's thousands of chimneys, street filth that got mixed in when the snow fell, probably some horse manure particles, because this is London and there's horse manure in everything. You drink it anyway because what choice do you have? But you make a mental note that melting snow is a last resort, not a strategy. The Thames ice is another option, theoretically cleaner since it's just frozen river water. Except the Thames is essentially London's sewer and has been for centuries. Everything that London wants to get rid of, waste, trash, dead animals, industrial runoff, the occasional body ends up in the river. Freezing doesn't purify it, freezing just makes it solid sewage. You'd have to be genuinely desperate to drink melted Thames ice. Which brings us to the entrepreneurs, those wonderful souls who've decided that a citywide water crisis is an excellent business opportunity. By mid-morning, they're out in force. Men with carts and barrels calling out, "Fresh water!" Clean water, penny a pint, a penny a pint. Let that sink in. In normal times, water is free. You walk to the conduit, fill your jug, walk home. It costs you nothing but time. Now, these bastards are charging a penny for a pintite pints to a gallon, which means a day's drinking water for one person costs you 8 pence. That's more than many Londoners earn in a day. You watch a woman argue with one of these water sellers, a ferret-faced man with a cart full of barrels. "This is extortion," she shouts. "Water should be free." "Water is free," the man agrees cheerfully. "You're paying for my labour in collecting and melting it. Don't like my prices? Go collect your own." She buys 2 pints. She has children at home. What else is she going to do? Historians still argue whether these ice miners, as they came to be called, were villainous profiteers or necessary service providers filling a gap in the market. From where you're standing watching people hand over coins they can't afford for water they desperately need, the distinction seems academic. Villainy and entrepreneurship aren't mutually exclusive, turns out. The ice miners work the frozen Thames with picks and shovels, chopping blocks of ice and hauling them to shore where they melt them over fires fueled by wood they've probably also bought or scavenged at inflated prices. It's actually quite a production. Some of them have set up proper operations with multiple barrels, keeping some melting, while others are ready to sell. The more ambitious ones have even hired assistants. A quirky detail: one ice miner near London Bridge has painted his cart bright red and written "God's honest water" on the side, as if divine endorsement makes his penny a pint price any less outrageous. He's doing tremendous business though, because people are gullible, and God's honest water sounds better than water I scooped from the frozen sewer. You don't buy water. Not yet. You're stubborn, and you're poor, and you're convinced you can make the snow-melting system work if you're just more efficient about it. You spend the afternoon in a cycle, collect snow, melt snow, drink disappointing water, repeat. By evening you've produced maybe half a gallon of water that tastes like ash and regret. Your back hurts from hauling snow. Your hands are chapped and raw, and you're still thirsty. That night, lying in your frigid corner, you do math that makes you want to weep. Water, food, and fuel, the three basic necessities of existence, have all become luxuries you can barely afford. The coal shortage means you can't stay warm. The bread shortage means you're hungry. And now the water shortage means you're thirsty. It's like London is systematically removing every comfort, every basic requirement for life, leaving you with nothing but cold and desperation. Outside, the frost continues. Inside, you ration the water you've melted like it's liquid gold, because, in a very real sense, it is. Tomorrow you'll probably break down and buy a pint from one of the ice miners. Tomorrow you'll hand over a penny you can't afford for water that should be free. Tomorrow you'll participate in the same exploitation you found so outrageous this morning. But tonight you're still holding out. Tonight, you're determined to be self-sufficient, to not give in, to maintain some shred of dignity in a winter that's systematically stripping everyone down to their most basic survival instincts. You take one small sip of your hard-earned ash-flavored water and try to make it last. It doesn't help. You're still thirsty. On the morning of January 3rd, you step over your first corpse. It's lying in the alleyway between Meg's building and the butcher's shop, curled in a position that looks almost peacefolk, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around the torso like someone trying to conserve warmth, even in death. You noticed the person yesterday, a beggar you'd seen around the neighbourhood, huddled against the wall with a thin blanket that looked like it had been stolen from a horse. You'd thought they were sleeping. They weren't sleeping. The face is waxy and pale, lips blue-tinged, eyes half open in a glassy stare that makes you look away quickly. There's no violence here, no blood, no obvious cause of death. The person simply stopped, ran out of warmth the way a candle runs out of wax, and then there was nothing left but a cold shell in a frozen alleyway. You don't stop. You don't report it. You just step carefully around the body and continue toward the street. Because what else are you supposed to do? The constable won't care a no dead beggar isn't worth the paperwork, especially when he's probably dealing with a dozen similar cases. The church might collect the body eventually when they get around to it, but frozen ground makes burial difficult, and London's gravediggers are already overwhelmed. For now, the corpse is just another obstacle in your path, like a pothole or a pile of horse manure. This is what the Great Frost does to people. Not just the dying that's almost expected, almost normal in a winter this brutal. It's what it does to the living, to you, making you step over dead bodies on your way to buy water you can't afford with money you don't have. Death becomes mundane. Tragedy becomes routine. By mid-morning, you've counted 3 more bodies. One in the doorway of a shuttered shop, another slumped against the wall of St. Saint Double. Olave's church, like they tried to reach sanctuary and didn't quite make it, and a third worst of Allah child, maybe 7 years old, curled up in a corner near the market. The child looks like they're sleeping, looks so peaceful that part of you wants to believe they'll wake up if you just call loudly enough. But you know better. The frost on their eyelashes tells the truth. Here's something the history books will record with clinical precision. An estimated 2,300 people froze to death in London during the Great Frost winter of 1684-85. That's the official number anyway, the count of bodies that were actually recorded and reported. Historians still argue whether the real number was higher, probably much higher, because plenty of deaths went unreported, especially among the poor, the homeless, the people who had no one to miss them or file complaints about their absence. Hypothermia is a peculiar way to die. You've heard stories about it from sailors and travellers, but you never quite understood until now. It doesn't announce itself with drama. There's no moment of crisis, no screaming or thrashing. Instead, it creeps up quietly, almost politely, like a gentleman caller who's come to take you somewhere you didn't realize you'd agreed to go. First comes the shivering, violent, uncontrollable shaking as your body tries desperately to generate heat. That's the stage where you can still save yourself if you can get warm and stay warm. But if you can't, if you're stuck outside in the cold with no shelter and no fuel and no hope, the shivering eventually stops. Not because you've gotten warmer, but because your body has started shutting down non-essential functions to preserve your core temperature. Then comes the confusion. You've seen this in the beggars over the past few days. They stop making sense, mumbling nonsense, unable to remember where they are or what they're doing. One old woman yesterday insisted she was at a summer fair in Kent, kept asking you where the strawberry sellers were. She was sitting in 3 inches of snow at the time. After confusion comes what sailors call paradoxical undressing. People who are freezing to death sometimes start removing their clothes, convinced they're overheating. You found a man last week, stark naked in an alleyway, his clothes folded neatly beside him like he'd prepared for bed. He was dead, frozen solid, and he'd removed every stitch of clothing before the end, his confused brain sending signals that had nothing to do with reality. The final stage is just stopping. Heart rate slows. Breathing becomes shallow. And then the body gives up the fight, shuts down completely, and that's it. Death by cold. Natural causes, the parish records will say, if they bother recording it at all. What makes it worse is how preventable it is. These people aren't dying from some exotic disease or violent crime. They're dying from lack of shelter, lack of fuel, lack of the most basic resources that the wealthy take for granted. Every corpse you pass represents someone who could have survived if they just had a warm room to sleep in, a fire to sit beside, a blanket that wasn't stolen from a horse. You pass a group of beggars huddled together near the bridge, sharing body heat in a pile that looks medieval and desperate. They're doing it right. Actually, multiple bodies together generate more warmth than one body alone. But you can see even from here that some of them aren't moving much, their faces slack and confused. By tomorrow, some of those bodies will be truly still, and the survivors will have to extract themselves from their dead companions and find someone new to huddle with. A quirky detail that will show up in one pamphleteer's account. A wealthy merchant named Theodore Godfrey set up a warming station in his warehouse, allowing the poor to come inside and sit by braziers for an hour at a time. Noble gesture, truly commendable. The catch? He charged a halfpenny for admission. Can't be giving away warmth for free, he apparently said. I'm charitable, not mad. Theodore Godfrey, ladies and gentlemen, proof that even mercy can have a price tag. The city is trying to respond in its inefficient, bureaucratic way. The churches are opening their doors during the day, though not at night, because property damage and theft are concerns even during humanitarian crises. Some wealthy families are distributing blankets, though distributing often means leaving in piles that get mobbed and fought over within minutes. The Lord Mayor has made noises about organising relief efforts, but noises don't keep people warm. What you're witnessing is triage on a citywide scale. London is deciding, consciously or not, who gets to survive this winter. The wealthy, obviously. They have coal stockpiles and warm houses and servants to fetch whatever they need. The middle class? Probably. They're struggling, burning furniture and rationing food, but they've got roofs and walls and some resources to draw on. The poor? That's the question. Some will make it through sheer luck or stubbornness or connections, but many won't. The bodies piling up in alleyways are the answer to that equation. You make it back to Meg's without stepping on any corpses, which feels like a small victory. Inside, someone has managed to get a fire going with what appears to be parts of a wagon wheel, and you crowd around it with the other lodgers, all of you desperate for warmth, all of you acutely aware that you're only a few bad days away from being the bodies in the alleyways instead of the people stepping over them. Tom, your landlord, mentions that the parish has started collecting the frozen dead in carts each morning. Like the plague years, he says quietly. Bring out your dead, all that. Except this time it's not disease, it's just, he gestures vaguely at the frozen window. This. You don't tell him about the 4 bodies you saw this morning. What's the point? Everyone's seeing the same thing. Everyone's doing the same mental calculations. How long can I last? How cold can it get before I become one of them? At what point does survival become impossible? That night, you add an extra layer of clothing before bed, everything you own, piled on top of yourself in a desperate attempt to trap warmth. You look ridiculous. Feel like you're wearing your entire wardrobe at once. Because you are. But vanity is a luxury, and you're fresh out of luxuries. You're running on necessities now, and even those are in short supply. Outside, the temperature drops further. Inside, you shiver, despite your layers, despite your best efforts, and try very hard not to think about those bodies in the alleyways. Try not to imagine yourself curled up in some doorway, growing colder and more confused until thought itself becomes impossible. Try not to calculate how many meals you've missed, how weak you're becoming, how much harder it is to stay warm when your body has no fuel to burn. You're still alive. For now. That's as much as anyone can hope for in January 1685. By January 5, something unexpected happens on the frozen Thames. Capitalism finds a way. Because of course it does. You might be starving, you might be freezing, you might have stepped over 4 corpses this morning, but that's not going to stop enterprising Londoners from turning catastrophe into commerce. The Frost Fair is born, not through official planning or civic organisation, but through the collective realisation that if the ice is going to be here anyway, someone might as well make money off it. The first stall appears near London Bridge on a grey Tuesday morning. You notice it while crossing the ices you're crossing now because walking around via the bridge costs a toll and you're too poor for unnecessary expenses. It's just a simple wooden frame with canvas stretched over it and a man inside selling hot chestnuts roasted over a brazier. The brazier itself is sitting directly on the ice, which seems insane until you realise the ice is probably 2 feet thick at this point and could support a small elephant, never mind a metal pot full of burning coals. Chestnuts, hot chestnuts. Warm your hands and fill your belly. The man's name is William Frost, which is either a cosmic joke or the most on-brand name possible for someone setting up shop on a frozen river. William has dragged his entire chestnut roasting operation onto the ice because, as he explains to anyone who'll listen, why should the cold keep me from making an honest living? Why indeed, William? Why indeed? By afternoon, William has been joined by 3 other vendors. There's a woman selling gingerbread, a man with a cart of second-hand clothes because apparently even on a frozen river, someone's thinking about fashion, and another fellow hawking what he claims is genuine French brandy, but is almost certainly diluted English gin with brown colouring. You don't buy any, you can't afford it, but you admire the hustle. The next day, there are a dozen stalls. The day after that, 2 dozen. It's like watching mushrooms sprout after rain, except instead of fungi, it's commercial enterprise blooming across the frozen Thames. By the end of the week, there's a proper market taking shape, with rough lanes marked out between the stalls and vendors, calling out their wares like it's Cheapside Market, just colder and significantly more likely to end with everyone drowning if the ice breaks. The variety of goods on offer is genuinely impressive. There are food sellers who can still get supplies anyway, offering pies, bread, roasted meats, and something one optimistic vendor calls oysters, though you're deeply suspicious of any seafood that's been sitting on ice for unknown hours. There are drink sellers with ale, gin, wine, and hot spiced wine for those with coin to spare. There are entertainers, a juggler who keeps dropping his balls because his hands are numb, a puppet show that's actually quite good, and a man with a dancing dog that looks as miserable as you feel. But the real attraction, the thing that makes this more than just a makeshift market, is the printing press. Someone and historians still argue about who exactly, though the name John Croom appears in several accounts here, dragged an actual printing press onto the ice. Not a small one either. A full-sized press, the kind that normally sits in a workshop producing pamphlets and broadsheets and seditious literature that gets people arrested. This madman has hauled it onto the Thames, set it up in a tent to protect it from the elements, and is now printing souvenir certificates for anyone willing to pay. You watch the operation with something approaching awe. The printer, a sharp-faced man in his 40s, who's clearly delighted with his own cleverness, created a standard form with blank spaces for names and dates. It reads, "This is to certify that name walked upon the frozen River Thames on date in the year of our Lord 1685 during the Great Frost. Sixpence for a basic certificate. A shilling if you want decorative borders. 18 pence for the deluxe version with an engraved image of the Thames frozen solid." It's absolutely ridiculous, charging people to prove they did something they're currently doing, and the line of customers stretches back 20 people deep. A quirky detail that will delight future historians, the printer has also prepared some certificates with pre-written humorous messages. One reads, "I survived the Great Frost, and all I got was this lousy certificate." Another, "Walked on water, 1685. Take that, Jesus. That second one is borderline blasphemous and probably offensive, but people are buying it anyway because nothing says "I defied death and nature," quite like mildly sacrilegious humour printed on cheap paper. You don't buy a certificate. Sixpence. Might as well be £6 for all the spare money you have right now. But you stand in the tent for a while, watching the press work, mesmerised by the mechanical rhythm of it. The printer inks the type, positions the paper, cranks the press, peels away the fresh certificate. Over and over, each one a small monument to human absurdity. We almost froze to death, but at least we got a souvenir. The Frost Fair, because that's what people are calling it, now spreads like a stain across the ice. Within 2 weeks, it'll stretch from London Bridge nearly to Westminster, a frozen mile of commerce and entertainment and sheer stubborn refusal to let winter win. But even now, in its early days, you can see the shape it's taking. Whole sections are developing distinct personalities. There's the food quarter where the smell of roasting meat makes your empty stomach ache, the entertainment district where musicians play for coins and acrobats perform tricks, and the gambling area where men roll dice and bet on ridiculous contests. Someone has set up a bowling alley on the ice. They've laid down planks to create lanes and are charging people to knock down pins while standing on a frozen river. The sheer confidence required to not only conceive this idea but execute it deserves some kind of award. There's a sense of carnival to the whole thing, a manic energy that feels both desperate and defiant. Yes, people are dying in the alleyways. Yes, you're hungry and cold and one bad week away from becoming another frozen corpse. But here on the ice, surrounded by vendors and entertainers and people determined to make the best of catastrophe, it's possible to forget that for a few minutes. Possible to pretend this is normal, even fun, rather than a dystopian nightmare where you're buying overpriced chestnuts on what used to be a shipping lane. Mainstream historical fact, the Frost Fair of 1684-85 was one of several frost fairs held on the Thames during particularly cold winters, but it was among the largest and best documented. The printing press certificates became collector's items, some of which still survive in museums today, physical proof that yes, this actually happened. The wealthy start arriving in the afternoons, dressed in their furs and finest cloaks, treating the Frost Fair like it's some exotic attraction put on for their amusement. You watch them picking their way across the ice in their expensive boots, servants trailing behind carrying purchases. They buy the deluxe certificates, of course, and trinkets and souvenirs. They pose for portrait painters who've set up easels on the ice. They laugh and point at the novelty of it all like this is a garden party rather than a survival strategy. The class divide has never been more visible. The poor come to the Frost Fair because they might be able to earn a few coins or find cheap food. The wealthy come for entertainment, for stories to tell at dinner parties, for the thrill of doing something unusual. You're occupying the same space, but living in entirely different realities. As the sun sets early, because it's January and the sun has better places to beather, fare takes on an almost magical quality. Torches and braziers light up across the ice, creating pools of flickering warmth in the darkness. The smoke rises in columns toward the stars. Music drifts across the frozen river, someone playing a fiddle, someone else singing. For a moment, just a moment, it's beautiful. Then you remember you're standing on a river in January, and you're hungry, and you're cold, and tomorrow you'll probably have to burn your trunk to stay warm. But tonight, for this brief moment, the Frost Fair offers something London desperately needs. Proof that humans can adapt to anything, even the impossible. The smell hits you first, before you even see what's causing it. Rich, fatty, unmistakable, the scent of roasting meat drifting across the frozen Thames like a physical presence. Your stomach, which has been operating on starvation rations for 2 weeks now, literally growls. Not a polite rumble, but an angry, demanding sound that makes the person next to you look over in sympathy. You follow your nose through the growing Frost Fair crowds, past the chestnut sellers and gingerbread vendors, past the gambling dens and the puppet shows, until you reach the source. And then you stop, because what you're seeing defies every instinct you have about ice, fire, and basic physics. There's an ox roasting on the Thames. A whole ox. Like an entire cow-sized animal on a massive spit, rotating slowly over a bonfire that's built directly on the ice. The bonfire isn't a small cooking fire or a modest brazier. It's a proper roaring blaze, the kind you'd build in a fireplace or a smithy, with flames leaping 3 feet high and heat radiating outward in waves you can feel from 10 yards away. Your brain, which has spent your entire life learning that ice plus fire water, cannot process what it's seeing. The ice should be melting. The spit should be sinking. The whole operation should be sliding into the Thames in a hissing, splashing disaster that ends with everyone involved getting very wet and possibly drowning. But it's not. The ice holds. The ox rotates. The fat drips and sizzles into the flames. Reality, apparently, has decided to take a day off. The man turning the spite a massive fellow with arms like tree trunks and a face red from heat and exertion catches you staring. "Never seen an ox roast before," he shouts over the crackling flames. "Not on a river?" you shout back. He grins, clearly delighted. Ice is 2 feet thick here, maybe more. Could roast a dozen oxen and it wouldn't care. He's probably exaggerating, but the confidence is impressive. This man is cooking livestock on frozen water and treating it like the most normal thing in the world. The operation is actually quite sophisticated once you look closer. They've built the fire in a metal brazier, which sits on a platform of stones to distribute the weight and provide some insulation between the flames and the ice. Is it completely safe? Absolutely not. But is it working? Undeniably. The ox has been roasting for hours by the look of it, the skin crackling and golden fat rendering and dripping in a way that makes your mouth water so hard you nearly embarrass yourself. A crowd has gathered to watch, because apparently ox roasting is premium entertainment when you've been eating barley bread and thin soup for 2 weeks. Children stand transfixed, eyes huge, probably having never seen this much meat in one place. Adults are more calculating, doing math in their heads. How much will a slice cost? Can I afford it? Is it worth sacrificing tomorrow's bread ration for meat today? The answer, you're about to learn, is that ox meat on the Frost Fair costs about triple what it would normally cost in a proper shop. Supply and demand, the spit turner explains cheerfully when someone complains. Had to drag this beast across the ice, didn't I? Build the fire. Tend it all day, risk my life on this frozen death trap? That costs extra. He's not wrong, technically. Getting a whole ox onto the ice and setting up this roasting operation was probably genuinely difficult. But charging 9 pence for a slice of meat that would cost 3 on dry land still feels like robbery with extra steps. You don't buy any. Of course you don't. 9 pence is more than you've got, And besides, you're saving your coins for essentials like water that's only slightly contaminated and bread that's only moderately stale. But you stand there anyway, breathing in the smell, letting your brain pretend that your stomach is being filled through scent alone. It doesn't work, but it's something. A quirky detail that won't make it into the formal histories, one of the ox roasts on the Frost Fair was organised as a fundraiser for watermen who'd lost their livelihoods when the Thames froze. The idea was noble help, the unemployed boatmen by roasting oxen and donating the proceeds. In practice, the organisers pocketed most of the money and the watermen got maybe a shilling each. Charity, 17th century style. By mid-afternoon, 3 more ox roasts have sprung up along the frozen Thames. Competition is fierce, with each roaster claiming his ox is superior. "Attend on Kent grain," one shouts. "Aged to perfection," another counters, though you're not sure how one ages an ox that was presumably alive until recently. "Blessed by a priest," a third proclaims, which seems unnecessary but apparently resonates with the more religious customers. Historians still argue whether the ox roasts were genuine community events or cynical profit-making schemes. The answer, as with most things on the Frost Fair, is probably both. Yes, people were making money hand over fist, but they were also providing hot food in a city where hot food had become scarce. Exploitation and service aren't mutually exclusive. The most ambitious ox roast is being organised by a butcher named Thomas Banks, who's not content with just one ox. Thomas has somehow acquired 3 oxen and is roasting them simultaneously in a triangle formation, the fires so close together that they create a zone of concentrated heat that feels like summer. People crowd around Thomas's operation not just for the food, but for the warmth, turning it into an impromptu gathering place. Smart man Thomas. He's not just selling meat, selling comfort. You watch a wealthy merchant's family approach one of the roasts, the merchant pompous in fur-trimmed velvet, his wife dripping with jewellery that could probably feed your entire street for a month. They buy slices of ox for their children, who take one bite and declare it too greasy before throwing the rest onto the ice. Just toss perfectly good meat onto the ground, well, ice, because it's slightly fattier than they prefer. You want to scream, or cry, or pick up the discarded meat and eat it yourself, except pride and the risk of public humiliation stop you. The fire tenders work in shifts, keeping the flames hot and the spit turning. It's genuinely hard. Laborth heat is intense, the spit is heavy, and standing in one place on the ice for hours makes your feet go numb. But they're being paid, which in January 1605 is enough to make almost any job worthwhile. One young man tells you he's earning a shilling a day just to turn the spit. "Best money I've made all winter," he says, sweat running down his face despite the cold. "Could do this forever if the ice holds." It won't, of course. Eventually, the ice will melt. The Thames will flow again, and all of this, the Frost Fair, the ox roasts, the bizarre carnival on frozen water will disappear like it never happened. But nobody's thinking about that now. Now, there's meat roasting and money changing hands and the impossible made routine through sheer human stubbornness. As evening approaches, the flames from the ox roasts light up the ice like beacons, visible from both banks. The smoke rises in thick columns, carrying the smell of roasting meat across London. In the alleyways, people are still freezing to death. In the workhouses, children are still starving. But here on the ice, there's fire and food and defiance, humanity's middle finger to winter's worst. You take one last deep breath of that meat-scented air, imprinting the smell in your memory, and turn away. Tomorrow's hunger can wait. Tonight, you got to smell something wonderful, even if you couldn't taste it. The next morning, you decide to actually examine the printing press operation more closely, because if you're going to be poor and starving on a frozen river, you might as well be educated about it. The tent housing the press is larger than you initially realized. A proper canvas structure that blocks the wind and probably cost more to transport and erect than you'll earn in a year. Inside, the press itself dominates the space, a imposing wooden contraption of screws, plates, and mechanical mystery. The printer you saw yesterday, John Croom, you learn from the sign hanging outside, is already at work despite the early hour. He's inking a plate with practiced efficiency, movements so smooth they're almost hypnotic. Ink, position, press, peel, repeat. Each certificate emerges damp and fresh, the text sharp against the white paper. Looking costs nothing, Croom says without glancing up. Buying costs sixpence. Staring without buying costs you my patience, which you'll find runs out quickly on cold mornings. Fair enough. You step inside properly, joining a small crowd of onlookers who are apparently also too poor to buy but too curious to leave. The tent smells of ink and damp paper and something else, ambition maybe, or the particular scent of someone who's figured out how to monetize catastrophe. Croom has 3 different certificate templates laid out on a bench. The basic model, sixpence, is simple text on plain paper. This certifies that name did walk upon the frozen Thames in the month of January, Anno Domini 1685, during the Great Frost. Straightforward, functional, about as exciting as a receipt for turnips. The middle option, 1 shilling, includes decorative, border-syllabrate scrollwork that probably took hours to engrave but adds exactly 0 practical value. It's the same certificate, just fancier, which is basically a metaphor for all luxury goods when you think about it. The deluxe version, 18p, is where Croom really shows off. This one has an engraved illustration at the top showing the frozen Thames with tiny figures skating and the bridge looming in the background. It's actually quite beautiful, detailed enough that you can make out individual buildings on the banks. Someone with genuine artistic talent created this. Then someone with genuine business sense realized they could charge people extra to own it. "How many have you sold?" someone in the crowd asks. Croom grins. 234 as of this morning, planning to hit 500 by week's end. He's not being boastful, just stating facts with the satisfaction of a man who's winning at capitalism. At an average of, what, 9p per certificate if you split the difference between the options. That's over £10 already. That's more than most Londoners earn in half a year, and Croom's making it by printing names on paper on a frozen river. You watch him complete another certificate, this one for a well-dressed woman who spelled out her absurdly long name, Elizabeth Ann, Catherine Worthington Smythe. Croom doesn't bat an eye, just carefully inks each letter of that aristocratic monstrosity and charges her the full 18p. She pays it happily, already imagining, you suspect, how she'll frame this and hang it in her parlour to prove she did something daring once. A quirky detail that Croom shares when someone asks, he's printing with ink he had to specially formulate for cold weather. Normal printing ink gets too thick in freezing temperatures, becomes stubborn and uncooperative. Croom's blend uses more linseed oil and some kind of spirits that keep it fluid even when it's cold enough to freeze your breath. Trade secret, he says with a wink. Learned it from a printer in Amsterdam. Dutch know their cold weather. The press itself is a marvel of engineering that you've never really appreciated before. The weight of easily several £100 of wood and metal rests on a platform of thick planks that distribute the load across the ice. Croom had to hire 6 men to drag it onto the Thames and position it, which cost him dearly, but clearly he's making it back and then some. "Doesn't it worry you?" a young apprentice asks. "The ice breaking, I mean. That press goes through, you've lost everything." Croom pauses in his work long enough to shrug. "Like's a gamble, boy. Could get trampled by a horse on dry land just as easy. At least here I'm making money while I risk dying. There's a certain logic to that, you suppose, even if it's the logic of someone who's either very brave or very stupid. Historians still argue whether the Frost Fair entrepreneurs were visionary businessmen or reckless gamblers who happened to get lucky. Maybe there's no difference. The certificates themselves are becoming status symbols, you realize. People are buying them not just as souvenirs, but as proof of their participation in history with a capital H. Everyone knows this winter is unusual, possibly unprecedented. The certificates are a way to claim your place in the story, to say, I was there, in a way that will survive long after the ice melts and the memories fade. Croom has even started offering custom messages for an extra 3p. You overhear him take an order from a young man who wants his certificate to read Walk the Thames whilst courting Miss Eleanor Davies, who said yes. It's sweet, actually, using the frozen apocalypse as a backdrop for a marriage proposal. Romance in the time of hypothermia. Another customer wants hers to say, survived the great frost to spite my sister Margaret, who said I wouldn't. Sibling rivalry, apparently, transcends natural disasters. The printing process is slower than you'd expect. Each certificate takes maybe 5 minutes from start to finish inking the plate, positioning the paper just right, working the press screw to apply even pressure, carefully peeling away the finished product. Croom works steadily, methodically, occasionally pausing to warm his hands over a small brazier he's got tucked in the corner. Even inside the tent, it's cold enough that his breath mists. By mid-morning, a queue has formed outside the tent, stretching back a dozen people. Some are wealthy tourists treating this as a novelty. Others are merchants and tradesmen who can justify the expense as a business investment, something to show customers, to prove they were part of this moment. A few, heartbreakingly, are clearly people who can't afford it, but are buying anyway because the desire to be remembered, to matter, outweighs practical financial concerns. You notice Croom offers no discounts, no charity certificates for the poor who want to participate. It's 6p minimum or nothing, and if you can't pay, you can't play. There's probably a lesson there about how history gets recorded only. Those with money get their names in the official account. The poor who walked these same frozen waters, who experienced the same impossibility, they'll be footnotes at best, anonymous masses, background characters in someone else's story. A mainstream historical fact that you're witnessing unfold. Several of Croom's Frost Fair certificates still exist in museums and private collections 300 years later. They're some of the only physical evidence of individual people's participation in the Great Frost, names preserved in ink when everything else about them has been lost to time. You leave the tent without buying anything, obviously, because 6p might as well be 6 guineas for all the spare money you have. But you've memorized what the certificates look like, the exact wording, the decorative borders. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the memory of being here, of seeing this strange moment in history, is its own kind of certificate, though it would have been nice to have your name printed, to exist in the official record, to matter enough that someone 300 years from now might look at your certificate and wonder who you were, what your life was like, whether you survived the winter that froze London solid. But survival first, documentation later, if there is a later. By January 10th, the Frost Fair has evolved beyond simple commerce into something stranger and more wonderful, a full-blown carnival where people are genuinely having fun on the same ice, where others are still freezing to death in nearby alleyways. The cognitive dissonance is spectacular. Welcome to humanity, where tragedy and entertainment coexist with barely a nod to each other. The games start appearing in clusters near the middle of the river, where the ice is thickest and people feel safest. First comes Skittles, basically medieval bowling, with someone setting up 9 wooden pins in a diamond formation and charging a penny for 3 throws. The lanes, such as they are marked out with rope on the ice, and the ball is just a wooden sphere that slides unpredictably because, surprise, ice is slippery. You watch a portly merchant take his turn, rolling the ball with tremendous confidence and absolutely zero skill. The ball veers left, misses all 9 pins entirely, and keeps sliding until it's a good 20 yards away. Someone's child has to chase it down and bring it back. The merchant pays for another round because pride is expensive, rolls again, and this time manages to clip 1 pin. He celebrates like he's won a tournament. The crowd gives him ironic applause. The entrepreneur running the Skittles operation, a shrewd woman named Bess Carter, who apparently saw Frozen River and thought business opportunity is making a killing. she's charging a penny per game, and there's a constant line of people waiting to throw wooden balls on ice and feel like they're doing something normal in a fundamentally abnormal situation. Bess has even hired a boy to reset the pins and fetch wayward balls, paying him in hot pies from a vendor 2 stalls down. Vertical integration at its finest. Next to the Skittles, someone has set up an actual bowling lanonaut, the 9-pin Skittles variation, but a proper long lane setup with 10 pins arranged in a triangle. This is fancier, more expensive, clearly aimed at wealthier customers. The lane is constructed from planks laid flat on the ice, creating a somewhat smoother surface. Somewhat being generous, because the planks are warped from cold and moisture, making every roll an adventure in physics. The bowling operation charges 3pence per game, which seems extortionate until you watch someone play and realize you're not just paying for the game, you're paying for the spectacle. The wealthy participants treat it like sport, taking it seriously in a way that's both admirable and ridiculous. Men remove their heavy cloaks to bowl properly, their form pristine, their concentration intense. They're bowling on a frozen river in January while people starve nearby, but by God, they're going to bowl with proper technique. A quirky detail that a pamphleteer will record later: one gentleman bowled such a powerful strike that a pin flew off the end of the lane and slid all the way to the Southwark bank, a distance of nearly 100 yards. The pin was returned by a helpful beggar who probably hoped for a coin as thanks and was, of course, disappointed. The gentleman's name? Sir Edmund Graves. His claim to fame? Best bowler on ice in recorded history. But the games, the skittles and bowling and various dice games scattered across the ice are just warm-up acts for the main event. The thing that makes you stop and genuinely question whether London has lost its collective mind: fox hunting on the frozen Thames. You hear about it before you see it. Rumours spread through the fair like wildfire. They're going to hunt fox on the ice. Proper hunt, horses and hounds and everything. It sounds impossible. It sounds insane. It sounds, you realise as you push through the crowd to get a better look, exactly like something the English aristocracy would attempt, because danger is more fun when you're wealthy enough to afford medical care. And there they are. A group of maybe a dozen riders on horseback, the horses stepping nervously onto the ice, clearly unhappy about this entire situation, but trained well enough to obey anyway. The riders are dressed in full hunting regaliard coats, tall boots, the works looking like they've wandered out of a country estate and gotten lost in a frozen apocalypse. The fox, you learn from excited spectators, was released onto the ice from a cage about 10 minutes ago. It's currently somewhere downstream, probably terrified and confused because foxes, unlike English aristocrats, have survival instincts. The hounds are straining at their leads, baying and howling, ready to chase. "This is mad," someone next to you mutters. "The horses will slip. Someone's going to die. They're not wrong." Horses on ice is already questionable. Horses on ice at a gallop, chasing hounds who are chasing a fox, while drunk aristocrats whoop and holler. That's not sport. That's natural selection with extra steps. The master of the hunt lord something. Or other, you didn't catch the full Namaraises. His horn and blows a long, clear note that echoes across the ice. The hounds are released. They bound forward in a pack, legs skittering and sliding, moving in this strange half-rune, half-skate combination that would be comical if they weren't closing in on a terrified fox at impressive speed. The horses follow. You watch in horrified fascination as the riders urge their mounts forward, the horses finding purchase in the ice through sheer determination and excellent horseshoe maintenance. They're actually doing it. They're actually hunting fox on the frozen Thames, turning catastrophe into entertainment, risk into recreation. Historians still argue whether the fox hunts on the Frost Fair were genuine sporting events or elaborate theatrical performances designed to impress the crowds. The distinction probably didn't matter much to the fox, who was having a terrible time either way. The hunt sweeps past you in a chaos of hoofbeats and baying hounds. Ice chips fly up from the horses' hooves. The riders are laughing, actually laughing, faces red with cold and exertion and pure adrenaline. One horse stumbles, nearly goes down, recovers at the last second while its rider whoops like he's just performed some great feat instead of narrowly avoiding a broken neck. The crowd follows the hunt, running alongside which is its own kind of madness because now you've got maybe 200 people sprinting across the ice to watch wealthy people chase an animal. You run too, because what else is there to do? This is the most exciting thing that's happened since the river froze. This is London turning disaster into spectacle, fear into sport. The fox makes it about 300 yards before the hounds corner it against a frozen wherry. You don't watch the actual kill. You've seen enough death this winter, but the crowd cheers anyway, and the hunters celebrate, and someone produces a flask of brandy that gets passed around among the gentry while the hounds tear apart their prize. By afternoon, sleds have appeared. Actual sleds, some of them quite elaborate, being raced across the ice in impromptu competitions. Children ride them shrieking with delight. Adults ride them, trying to maintain dignity while sliding across frozen water. One particularly ambitious group has rigged a sail to their sled, using the wind to propel them at speeds that seem genuinely dangerous. You watch a race between two sleds, both carrying merchants who've bet significant money on the outcome. They push off simultaneously, their runners hissing across the ice. One sled pulls ahead, then the other, then they're neck and neck. The crowd is screaming encouragement. Someone is taking bets on the side. The sleds cross the finish, line someone's coat thrown across the ice in, a virtual tie, leading to arguments about who actually won that will probably continue for weeks. A mainstream historical fact. Contemporary accounts describe sledding races, bowling matches, and even fox hunts taking place on the frozen Thames during the Great Frost, transforming the river into what one pamphleteer called a theatre of winter amusements for persons of all ranks. As evening falls and the torches are lit across the fair, you realise what you're witnessing. London is refusing to surrender. Yes, people are dying. Yes, you're hungry and cold and probably not going to make it through the winter without losing something: weight, health, possessions, maybe your life. But right now, right here, there are people playing games on impossible ice, hunting foxes where ships should be sailing, racing sleds where watermen should be rowing. It's defiance. It's madness. It's the most human thing you've ever seen. The parties start on January 12th, and you know about them because the noise is impossible to ignore. While you're standing in line at a church distribution point hoping for stale bread, there's actual music drifting across the ice from the middle of the river. Not a lone fiddler or a street musician. We're talking multiple instruments in harmony, the kind of music that requires coordination and people who've eaten recently enough to have the energy for culture. You abandon the bread linnets not moving anyway, too many people and too little food, and make your way onto the ice to investigate. What you find is so absurd, so perfectly emblematic of London's class divide, that you actually laugh out loud. It's either laugh or scream, and you're trying to conserve energy. Someone has constructed a pavilion on the ice. Not a tent, not a stellar proper pavilion with silk hangings and carpets and furniture that looks like it was recently in somebody's very expensive house. Inside this impossible structure, visible through the open sides, aristocrats are having a party. An actual party, with musicians and servants and what appears to be a full formal dinner service. The contrast is spectacular. You, standing here in clothes you haven't washed in weeks because water is too precious to waste on laundry, haven't eaten a proper meal in 10 days. Them, 20 yards away across the ice, dressed in ermine-trimmed cloaks and enough jewellery to buy a small house, eating off silver plates while servants pour wine. It's like two different species occupying the same frozen landscape. A woman in the pavilion, you can tell she's someone important by the way everyone defers to Harris, actually sledding. Well, sledding is generous. She's sitting on an ornate sled that looks more like a mobile throne, being pulled across the ice by two servants while she waves a handkerchief and laughs. Her cloak is white ermine, which means she's either phenomenally wealthy or royalty or both. The fur alone probably cost more than your entire building is worth. "That's Lady Cavendish," someone near you whispers, a street vendor who's been working the fair long enough to recognise the players. Threw this whole party just to prove she could. Brought the pavilion and the furniture and everything across from her house in Mayfair. "Must be nice," you mutter, and the vendor snorts. "Nice? She's got a brazier in there burning coal. Real coal. Must be going through £5 an hour just to keep the tent warm. That's more coal than I'll see all winter." "You do the math." £5 of coal per hour, even at pre-crisis prices. You can't even calculate it. It's more money than you can conceptualize, being burned purely for ambience while people freeze to death in doorways less than a quarter mile away. The party seems to be some kind of ice picnic. Tables are set up inside the pavilion, laden with food that makes your stomach ache just looking at it. You can see roasted bird's geese maybe, or swans if they're being really fancy. Pastries arranged in towers. Fruits that must have cost a fortune since nothing's in season and imports are barely trickling in. Wine bottles standing in buckets of... Is that ice? Are they chilling their wine with ice while sitting on a frozen river? The irony is so thick you could cut it with one of their silver knives. A quirky detail you'll hear about later. Lord Pembroke threw an ice party where he served only frozen delicacies, ices, sorbets, chilled wines, and cold meatses. A theme. The joke being that everything in London was frozen anyway. Why not lean into it? His guests apparently found this hilarious. You find it offensive, but nobody asked you. More aristocrats arrive while you watch, being ferried across the ice in sedan chairs carried by servants. Hares on ice. The chairs slide and slip, the carriers struggling to maintain their footing, and the passengers complain about the rough ride like they're in carriages on a bad road instead of being physically carried across a frozen river by people who probably haven't eaten today. One couple arrives on a sled pulled by a dog, not a working dog, but one of those ridiculous tiny lapdogs that wealthy women carry around. The dog is wearing a coat. An actual tailored coat with brass buttons. The dog has better clothing than you do. This is the world you live in now. Historians still argue whether these ice parties were genuine social events or calculated displays of wealth designed to demonstrate superiority during a crisis, as if those things are mutually exclusive, as if the wealthy haven't always thrown parties specifically to prove they're wealthy. You watch servants people who probably live in conditions not much better than yours. They're masters on the ice. One servant trips, nearly drops a platter of food, catches it at the last second. His employer doesn't even glance at him, doesn't thank him for saving the meal, just continues his conversation with another gentleman about, "You overhear the quaint charm of the Frost Fair." Quaint charm. That's what this is to them. Quaint, charming, an adventure to talk about later, a story to bore their grandchildren with. Yes, I attended Lady Cavendish's ice party during the Great Frost. Quite the experience. Meanwhile, you're trying to decide which is more edible, your boot leather or the leather of your belt. The music plays on a quartet of some kind, strings and possibly a flute. They're quite good, actually, which makes sense because the wealthy don't hire mediocre musicians. The sound carries across the ice, incongruous and beautiful, and you hate that you're enjoying it even a little. Music is a luxury, entertainment is a luxury, and you're standing here stealing both by proximity while your stomach digests itself. More sleds appear, these ones racing for sport rather than transportation. The aristocrats have turned ice sledding into a competition, with servants marking out courses and someone officiating races. Money changes hands on bets that could feed a family for a month. They're gambling more on a single sled race than you've earned in the past year. Lady Cavendish's white ermine cloak catches your eye again as she glides past on her absurd thronzeld, laughing at something one of her companions said. The ermine is spotless, perfectly white, probably kept in someone's job just to maintain it. You're wearing a cloak that's more whole than fabric at this point, held together by hope and strategic pinning. The visual contrast, you imagine, would make an excellent political cartoon, if anyone cared about political cartoons right now. A mainstream historical fact, Several contemporary accounts describe elaborate parties thrown by London's elite on the frozen Thames, with one diarist noting that the quality seemed to view the frost as an opportunity for novel entertainment rather than the catastrophe it represented for the lower orders. By late afternoon, the party is still going strong. More guests arrive, more food appears, more wine flows. The braziers keep burning, coal turning to heat and smoke, and the casual display of resources that others would kill for. You've been standing here for 2 hours now, watching, and you realize this is a kind of torture. Tantalus starving in sight of food. You freezing in sight of warmth. You turn away before the anger becomes something you can't control. Before you do something stupid like shout at them or throw something or otherwise draw attention to yourself as a poor person who's not properly grateful for the opportunity to witness their magnificence. The guards stationed around the pavilion, because of course they're a guard's watch, you go with expressions that suggest they've been doing this all day, ushering away the poor who get too close to wealth. Walking back towards Southwark, you pass the ox roasts and the gaming stalls and the printing press tent. The Frost Fair's regular commerce feels almost egalitarian compared to the ice parties. Here, at least, everyone's just trying to make money or spend it. The class system still exists, but it's not quite so blatant, not quite so cruel. That night, you do actually consider eating your boot leather. Not seriously, you're not that desperate yet, but you examine your boots with a kind of clinical interest, wondering what nutritional value they might have. The leather is old, dried, probably tough as wood. You'd need to boil it for hours to make it even remotely chewable, and you don't have fuel for that. Also, you need your boots. Walking barefoot in January sounds like an express route to frostbite and gangrene. So the boots stay on your feet where they belong, and your stomach stays empty. And somewhere across the ice, Lady Cavendish probably goes home to her warm house and her warm bed and her full larder, already planning her next ice party, her next opportunity to demonstrate that catastrophe, like everything else, is much more pleasant when you're rich. Word count 1,481. By January 14th, you learn an important lesson. When people get desperate enough, morality becomes negotiable. And nowhere is this more apparent than on the frozen Thames after dark, when the Frost Fair's cheerful commerce gives way to something considerably less legal. The watermen are the key to understanding what's happening. These men, hundreds of them, have made their living ferrying people and goods across the Thames since they were old enough to handle an oar. It's skilled work, knowing the currents and tides, navigating between the ships at anchor, avoiding the treacherous spots near the bridge. Their fathers were watermen, their grandfathers, probably back to the Romans for all you know. It's not just a job, it's an identity. And then the river froze, and overnight, that identity became worthless. No river traffic means no waterman. No waterman means no income. No income means starvation. You've seen them around the fair, these displaced boatmen standing in clusters looking simultaneously lost and dangerous. Some have found work as porters, hauling goods across the ice for merchants. Others have set up as guides, offering to show wealthy tourists the safest routes across the frozen Thames for a fee. But there aren't enough of these jobs to go around, and watermen aren't trained for anything except the river, which is how you end up witnessing your first ice robbery. It happens near dusk, when the fair is transitioning from daytime commerce to nighttime entertainment. The torches aren't fully lit yet, creating pools of shadow across the ice. You're heading back toward the Southwark Bank, taking a route that avoids the main crowds, because crowds mean pickpockets, and you have nothing worth picking, but you'd rather not find out the hard way. 3 men step out from behind a frozen wherry, blocking your path. Not aggressive, not yet, just present. You recognize one of them, Jack Bowman, a waterman you've seen around Southwark for years. Nice enough fellow in normal times, always had a joke and a wave. Now his face is hard, eyes calculating in a way that makes your stomach drop. "Evening," Jack says, not quite friendly. "Evening," you reply, trying to sound casual while your brain screams at you to run. "Bit late to be out here alone," one of Jack's companions notes. He's a massive fellow, broad-shouldered in the way of men who've spent their lives rowing against the current. Ice can be dangerous in the dark. You're being threatened. Politely, almost professionally, but definitely threatened. The subtext is clear. Give us something valuable, or the ice gets very dangerous very quickly. Here's your problem. You genuinely have nothing worth stealing. Your pockets contain exactly 3 farthings not, even enough for a loaf of bread. Your clothes are worthless rags. You're not even wearing anything metal except a cheap buckle on your belt. You are possibly the worst robbery target in London. "I'm broke," you say honestly, showing them your empty palms. Properly broke. You can check if you want, but you'll be disappointed. Jack and his companions exchange glances. You can see the calculation happening. Is this person lying, or actually as poor as they claim? Do we waste time searching them, or cut our losses and find a better target? A quirky detail you'll hear about later, one gang of former watermen developed a signature move where they drill a hole in the ice near someone's feet and threaten to widen it unless paid. Pure psychological warfare. The victim could see the water below, black and deadly, and usually paid up quickly. The gang called themselves the Icebreakers, which is either clever or deeply unoriginal, depending on your perspective. "Go on then," Jack finally says, stepping aside. "But be more careful. Lots of desperate men out here these days. Not everyone's as understanding as us. You don't run. Running would suggest fear, and fear invites pursuit, but you walk away considerably faster than you arrived. Your heart is hammering, and you realize how close that came to going very differently. 3 against 1 in the shadows, no witnesses, ice and desperation and desperation. You could have ended up in the Thames with a split skull, written off as an accident, another casualty of the Great Frost. The black market operates more openly than the robberies. You discover it by following rumours and whispers, the kind of information that spreads through London's poor like contagion. Cheap coal near Westminster. Someone selling bread, no questions asked. Meat for sale, probably don't ask where it came from. The operation you find is tucked between 2 frozen barges, using the hulls as walls and canvas stretched overhead as a roof. Inside, men are selling everything the legitimate market can't or won't provide. Coal at half the official price, which means it's definitely stolen. Bread that probably fell off a delivery cart fell or was helped to fall. Firewood that looks suspiciously like someone's fence. The man running this particular black market stall is a former waterman named Thomas Pike, who's apparently pivoted from ferrying passengers to fencing stolen goods with admirable flexibility. Everything's legitimate, he assures you, with a completely straight face while standing over a pile of coal that definitely came from someone's stockpile, just offering competitive prices in a free market. Historians still argue whether the black market that flourished during the Great Frost was a necessary safety valve that kept the poor from starving, or a criminal enterprise that made the crisis worse by disrupting legitimate supply chains. The answer, as usual, is probably both. You don't buy anything. You still can't afford even black market prices, but you note the location for future reference. Desperation makes criminals of everyone eventually. You're not there yet, but yet is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The river pirates are a different breed entirely. These aren't desperate watermen stealing to survive. These are professional criminals who've realized the frozen Thames offers unique opportunities. Ships are locked in the ice, unable to move, their cargo accessible to anyone willing to climb aboard. The ship owners can't exactly guard them 24/7, and the city watch is spread too thin to patrol the entire frozen river. You hear about a cargo ship near Tower Bridge that was systematically looted over 3 nights. First, the accessible goods disappeared, barrels of wine, crates of fabric, anything that could be carried off the ice. Then the looters got ambitious and started dismantling the ship itself, removing copper fittings, brass hardware, anything metal that could be sold. By the time the owners realized what was happening, the ship had been partially cannibalized, its valuable components scattered across London's black markets. A mainstream historical fact, contemporary accounts describe a significant increase in theft and robbery during the Great Frost, with one magistrate noting that the frozen river has become a highway for villainy, with former honest men turned thief by necessity and want. The violence is usually implied rather than explicit. Most of the ice criminals are smart enough to avoid actual murder-dead bodies, bring investigations, and investigations are bad for business. But the threat is always there, lurking in the shadows between the torches, in the areas of the fair where the crowd's thin and the law doesn't reach. You start avoiding the ice after dark. It's not worth the risk. Whatever small advantages the fair might offer slightly warmer air near the braziers, the possibility of finding dropped coins, the entertainment value, they're not worth encountering. Jack Bowman and his friends again. Next time you might not be poor enough to be worthless. That night, back in your frozen corner at Meg's, you think about how quickly civilization breaks down when the temperature drops low enough. 2 weeks ago, Jack Bowman was an honest waterman. Now he's shaking down people on the ice, 1 step away from outright robbery, maybe 2 steps away from murder. The Great Frost didn't create criminality, just revealed how thin the line between law-abiding and lawless really is when survival is at stake. You're still on the legal side of that line. Barely. But you can feel it there, that edge, getting closer every day you go hungry, every night you freeze, every morning you wake up and have to decide whether survival is worth compromising, whatever principles you still have left. On January 16th, you notice your fingers aren't working quite right. Not painful, exactly more like they've stopped being fully part of your body. The tips are white and waxy, and when you try to make a fist, 2 of them don't quite curl properly. This is concerning. This is very, very concerning. You're not alone. All across London, people are discovering that prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures has consequences beyond general discomfort. Frostbite is creeping through the population like a slow plague, attacking extremities with methodical cruelty. Fingers, toes, noses, ears, anything that sticks out gets hit first. The barber surgeon shops are doing tremendous business, which is never a good sign. Barber surgeons, for those fortunate enough to have never needed one, are the medical professionals who handle everything actual physicians won't touch, pulling teeth, setting bones, bleeding patients, and apparently now dealing with frozen flesh. Their shops are identifiable by the red and white striped poles outside, which traditionally represent blood and bandages, but today might as well represent abandon hope, all ye who enter here. You join the queue outside Silas Blackwell's shop on Long Lane because Silas is cheap, relatively competent, and hasn't killed anyone in at least 6 months that you know of. The queue stretches back a dozen people, all of them holding injured hands or limping on frozen feet. One man has wrapped his hand in cloth so thoroughly it looks like a club. A woman is weeping silently, cradling fingers that have gone black at the tips. The man ahead of you in line has ears that look like they've been dipped in wax, pale white and stiff. Had them checked yesterday, he tells you conversationally, like discussing frozen body parts is normal social interaction now. Surgeon says they might fall off. Might not. Won't know till they thaw, apparently. Comforting, you mutter. Could be worse. My brother lost 3 toes already. Just turned black and dropped off when he took his boot off. Didn't even hurt, he said. Just gone. You really didn't need to hear that. Inside Blackwell's shop, the scene is controlled chaos. The barber surgeon himself is a thin man with permanently bloody apron and the kind of confidence that comes from years of cutting into people who can't afford to be picky about qualifications. He's currently examining a woman's frost-blackened toes with the critical eye of someone appraising fish at market. Right, Blackwell announces. 2 options. Option 1, we wait and see if the flesh recovers. Might do, might not. If it doesn't, you'll get gangrene and die, but at least you'll still have all your toes until then. Option 2, I take them off now, before the rot sets in. You'll live, but you'll be short 2 toes. Your choice. This is medicine in 1685, brutal honesty with a side of surgical intervention. The woman chooses amputation because apparently having 8 toes is better than dying with 10. You don't watch the actual procedure. You can hear it clearly enough, the saw working through bone, the woman screaming despite the leather strap between her teeth. The smell is worse than the sound, burned flesh, as Blackwell cauterizes the wounds with a red-hot iron. Barber surgery, now with added barbecue aroma. Orchestrated historical narrative balancing dark humour with scholarly rigour. Good progress. I need to continue with the dubious remedies, folk cures, and the contrast between what barber surgeons do versus actual physicians. Include the scholarly debate element. Keep the dark humour, but also the genuine horror of the situation. When your turn comes, Blackwell examines your fingers with rough efficiency, bending them, prodding them, making you wince. Not too bad, he pronounces. 2nd-degree frostbite, maybe light 3rd. Might recover on their own if you keep them warm and don't do anything stupid. And if they don't recover, then they go black, die, and I cut them off. That'll be 2 a pence for the consultation. 2 a pence for might be fine, might need amputation, medicine is a bargain. But Blackwell isn't just offering diagnoses. Like every barber surgeon in London, he's also selling remedies. The shelf behind him is stocked with bottles and jars containing God knows what, each labelled with claims that range from optimistic to outright fantastical. Dr. Blackwell's miracle frostbite salve, he announces, holding up a jar of grey paste that looks like it was scraped off a stable floor. Guaranteed to restore warmth to frozen flesh. Only 6pence. What's in it, you ask, because you're not completely stupid. Trade secret. Proprietary blend of healing ingredients. Is one of those ingredients goose fat? Might be. And the others? Also might be goose fat. So it's goose fat. Possibly just goose fat. For 6pence. You pass. A quirky detail that will horrify future medical professionals. One popular frostbite remedy circulating during the Great Frost involved rubbing frozen flesh with snow to gradually restore warmth. This is precisely backwards rubbing. Frostbitten tissue causes further damage, and snow obviously doesn't warm anything. But the theory sounded logical enough that people tried it anyway, making their injuries worse while congratulating themselves on using natural medicine. The actual physicians, the ones with medical degrees from universities who wouldn't touch a patient with their own hands if they could help have their own approaches. Dr. Edmund Havers, one of London's more prominent physicians, has published a pamphlet on frostbite treatment that's circulating among those who can read and afford pamphlets. His recommendations, which you hear about second-hand from someone who heard them from someone else, keep the affected area warm but not hot. Drink warm liquids. Avoid alcohol. Despite what you've heard about brandy providing warmth, it actually makes hypothermia worse. And most importantly, don't rub frozen tissue. Historians still argue whether 17th century physicians' frostbite treatments were genuinely helpful or just less actively harmful than the alternatives. The sad truth is that medical knowledge about cold injuries was primitive at best, and most treatments were based on theory rather than evidence. The divide between physicians and barber surgeons plays out in real time. Physicians say, keep warm, wait for natural recovery. Barber surgeons say, cut off the dead bits before they kill you. Both approaches have merit. Both approaches have killed people. Medicine in 1685, at least we're trying. Meanwhile, folk remedies proliferate like mushrooms after rain. Everyone has a theory, a cure, something their grandmother swore by. Wrap frostbitten fingers in wool soaked in urine. The ammonia supposedly restores life. Hold frozen feet near a fire until they hurt again. Congratulations, you've just burned already damaged tissue. Drink hot wine mixed with ground pepper. This one might actually help with circulation, though probably not for the reasons people think. You see a woman at the market selling proven frostbite cure? A tincture that's definitely just coloured water with some herbs floating in it. She's doing brisk business because desperate people will buy anything that promises relief. The placebo effect is alive and well in the 17th century. A mainstream historical fact. Contemporary medical texts from the 1680s show physicians debating whether frostbite was caused by excessive cold humours corrupting the flesh or by vaporous spirits being frozen within the body. Neither theory was correct, but they represented genuine attempts to understand and treat a condition that was killing and maiming thousands. The amputations continue throughout the day. You hear them, the saw, the screaming, the smell of cauterized flesh. Blackwell works steadily, methodically, removing dead tissue and trying to save lives. He's not a monster. He's not even incompetent, really. He's just working with 17th century medical knowledge and tools that haven't changed much since medieval times. By the time you leave his shop, your fingers still attached and only twopence poorer, you've made a decision. You're keeping your hands warm no matter what it takes. Burn the trunk. Burn the remaining furniture. Burn your spare clothes if necessary. Because watching those amputations has clarified something important. You really, really want to keep all 10 fingers. That night, you wrap your hands in every scrap of fabric you own, creating massive cloth mittens that make you look ridiculous but trap precious warmth. Your fingers throb as blood flow slowly returns, painful but alive. Still yours, still working, still attached. Outside, the frost continues its work, attacking exposed flesh, claiming fingers and toes and ears, filling barber surgeon shops with screaming patients, and filling the air with the smell of burned flesh and desperation. On January 18th, you're woken at an ungodly hour by someone screaming about the end times in the street below. Not metaphorical, screaming, actual screaming, the kind that suggests either genuine religious fervor or complete mental collapse. Possibly both. At this point in the winter, the line between prophetic vision and cold-induced delirium is gossamer-thin. You drag yourself to the window and peer out through the frost-covered cloth. Standing in the street, arms raised to the grey pre-dawn sky, is a man you vaguely recognise from the parish. Edmund Cross, washerwoman's husband, usually a quiet fellow who keeps to himself. Now he's proclaiming that God has frozen the Thames as punishment for England's sins, and unless everyone repents immediately, worse is coming. The rivers shall turn to stone, Edmund shouts, breath steaming. The very air shall freeze solid. The sun itself shall be extinguished. Repent, ye sinners, before the final judgment. It's barely 6 a.m. You're too cold, too hungry, and too tired to care about eternal damnation. If God wants to judge you, he's going to have to wait until you've had something resembling breakfast and maybe thawed your fingers. But Edmund isn't alone. The Great Frost has unleashed a wave of religious panic across London that makes the usual Sunday guilt look tame by comparison. Preachers, both the legitimate ordained kind and the self-appointed street corner variety have decided that a frozen Thames is obviously divine retribution, and they're not being shy about sharing this revelation. The most prominent voice belongs to Reverend Thomas Vincent, a nonconformist minister who's been writing pamphlets faster than the Frost Fair printing press can produce souvenir certificates. His latest work, which is being sold at every street corner for a penny, God's Terrible Voice in the Frost, A Warning to a Frozen England. Catchy title. Terrible theology, but catchy. You've read bits of it well. Someone read bits of it aloud at the breadline, and you were trapped in the queue with nothing better to do. Vincent's thesis is straightforward. London has sinned. God is angry. The frozen Thames is punishment, and unless everyone repents and returns to godly living, things will get worse. What worse looks like when you're already starving and freezing, Vincent doesn't specify. Apparently infinite divine wrath has the imagination to come up with something. The pamphlet includes a helpful list of sins that might have angered God enough to freeze the Thames. The list is comprehensive. Drunkenness, fornication, gambling, theatre-going, dancing, wearing excessive finery, working on Sundays, not working hard enough on weekdays, reading the wrong books, having impure thoughts, and this one's particularly bold, attending the wrong kind of church services. So basically, everyone in London is guilty of something. Very convenient for pamphlet sales. A quirky detail that shows up in several contemporary accounts. One street preacher named Isaiah Turner claimed to have received a vision showing that the Thames would only thaw when exactly 1,000 Londoners had publicly repented. He started keeping count of repentances in a ledger, crossing off names like some kind of apocalyptic accountant. When the river eventually thawed without hitting his quota, Isaiah quietly disappeared and was never heard from again. The established church isn't much better. Sunday services had become exercises in doom and gloom, with ministers competing to deliver the most terrifying sermons about divine judgment. You attended St. Olivet's last week mostly for the body heat provided by packed pews and listened to Reverend Makepeace. Yes, that's his actual name, and yes, the irony is lost on him. Explain how the frost was a sign of God's displeasure with the current moral state of the nation. Look upon the frozen waters and despair, he thundered from the pulpit. The Lord has stopped the very flow of nature to show his anger. The Thames, which has run for time immemorial, now lies still as death. What greater sign could he send? Someone in the back, you suspect it was old Tom from the docks, muttered that a slightly warmer winter might have been a clearer sign of divine favour, but he was quickly shushed. Historians still argue whether the religious panic during the Great Frost was a genuine spiritual crisis or an opportunistic power grab by ministers who saw catastrophe as a chance to increase church attendance and donations. The answer, as usual, is probably both. Nothing clarifies religious conviction quite like the possibility of freezing to death. The Catholics, who are supposed to keep quiet about their faith in Protestant England, have apparently decided that apocalyptic winters are worth risking arrest. You've heard whispers about a priest holding secret masses in Southwark, promising that proper Catholic repentance will end the frost. The Protestant preachers are furious, claiming that it's Catholic sins that caused the problem in the first place. The theological arguments are vicious and complicated and completely irrelevant to your frozen fingers. Pamphlets proliferate like plague rats. Every literate person with access to a printing press has apparently decided to publish their theory about what the frost means. You've seen titles like A True Relation of God's Judgment upon London, The Frozen Thames, A Sign and a Wonder, Repent or Freeze, A Moral Examination of the Great Frost, The Icebound Sinner's Last Chance for Salvation. They're selling for a penny each, which means every penny spent on religious panic is a penny not spent on food or fuel. But people buy them anyway, desperate for explanation, for meaning, for some assurance that this nightmare has a purpose. The street preachers are everywhere now, competing for attention and donations. Near the bridge, you count 4 separate prophets within shouting distance of each other, each proclaiming a different timeline for the apocalypse. One says the world will end in March. Another claims June. A third insists the end already happened and everyone's actually dead. We just haven't noticed yet. That last theory is creative, at least. Your personal favourite is Brother Nathaniel, who's set up shop literally. He's built a small platform and the ice itself. His gimmick is that he'll only preach standing on the frozen Thames because it's the very symbol of God's power. He's out there every day, rain or shine, though it's been mostly snow, delivering fire and brimstone sermons while slowly losing feeling in his toes. You respect the commitment, even if you think the theology is nonsense. A mainstream historical fact, contemporary sources document a significant increase in church attendance and religious publication during the Great Frost, with one observer noting that the frozen Thames has done more for piety in 3 weeks than all the bishops in 3 years. The problem with all this religious fervour is that it offers exactly zero practical help. Repentance doesn't make you warm. Prayer doesn't fill your stomach. Faith won't regrow frostbitten fingers. You're not against religion. You go to church, you say your prayers, you're as Christian as the next freezing person. But the gap between God is testing us and here's actual food and fuel is pretty significant. Some ministers at least try to be helpful. St. Saviour's is still distributing bread, though they do make you sit through a sermon first. Fair trade, honestly. 15 minutes of guilt about your sins in exchange for bread that might keep you alive another day. Father Gregory at the Catholic Chapel is running a soup kitchen out of a basement, feeding anyone who shows up regardless of their faith. He's going to get arrested eventually, but in the meantime his soup is saving lives. But most of the religious response is just noise. Loud, insistent noise about sin and judgment and repentance while people freeze and starve. Edmund Cross is still in the street below, still shouting about the end times. Someone throws a chamber pot at him, thankfully empty, or at least mostly empty. Edmund takes it as persecution for righteousness' sake and shouts louder. You close the cloth over your window and try to get another hour of sleep before you have to face the day. If God is judging England, he's going to have to get in line behind hunger, cold, and frostbite. You'll worry about eternal damnation after you've figured out where your next meal is coming from. Besides, you're too cold to care about hell. Hell is probably warm. On January 20th, you witness something that makes you angrier than you've been this entire winter. And that's saying something, because anger has been your default setting for weeks now. You're crossing the ice near midday when you spot a group of children playing on the frozen Thames. Normal enough children have been all over the fair since it started, running between the stalls, begging for coins, generally treating the whole catastrophe like an unexpected holiday. But these aren't those children. These children are dressed in velvet cloaks with fur trim. They're wearing proper winter boots, not rags wrapped around their feet with string. Their cheeks are pink from cold and exertion, not grey from malnutrition. They're being supervised by two servants who look simultaneously bored and frozen, standing at a respectful distance while their charges shriek with delight. The children, there are 4 of them, ranging from maybe 6 to 12 years old, have brought sleds onto the ice. Proper sleds, not cobbled-together boards and rope. These are painted, polished, with metal runners that catch the weak winter sunlight. One has actual cushions on it. Cushions. For sledding. Because apparently sliding down ice isn't comfortable enough without padding. You watch them race their sleds down a gentle slope someone's built from packed snow, screaming with joy as they slide across the frozen Thames. When they reach the bottom, the servants drag the sleds back up for another run. The children don't even have to walk. They just sit on their sleds and get pulled, like tiny aristocratic cargo being shipped uphill. Again, the smallest one demands. A girl with blonde ringlets that probably took her maid an hour to arrange. Again, the Savanta young woman who looks absolutely miserable in the cold obediently hauls the sled back up. She's not wearing gloves. Her hands are red and chapped, and you can see them shaking as she grips the sled rope. But she smiles when the child looks at her, because of course she does. Her employment depends on keeping this overfed cherub happy. The contrast makes you want to scream. 2 nights ago, you stepped over a child's frozen corpse in an alleyway off Bermondsey Street. A boy, maybe 8 years old, curled up like he was sleeping. No parents, no name. Just another dead orphan that the parish would eventually collect and bury in an unmarked grave with a dozen others. And here, 50 yards away, these pampered children are playing, warm and fed and utterly oblivious to the suffering happening around them. A quirky detail you'll hear about later, the children of one wealthy merchant family brought a portable hot chocolate service onto the ice-actual servants with a portable stove, warming chocolate while their children played. The servants had to keep the fire going, heat the chocolate to exactly the right temperature, and serve it in silver cups on the ice. 3 servants, full-time, just for hot chocolate. Meanwhile, children were literally dying of exposure within shouting distance. London's street children are everywhere if you know where to look. And if you don't know where to look, they'll find you hands out, voices pleading, eyes hollow with hunger. "Spare a farthing, sir. Please, miss, just a crust of bread. My mother's sick and my father's dead and I haven't eaten in 3 days. Some of them are lying. Most of them aren't. The truth is almost always worse than the begging pitch. You know several of these children by sight now. There's little Tom, who can't be more than 6, who sleeps in a barrel near the fishmonger's stalls and has a cough that sounds like it's tearing his lungs apart. There's Marianne, maybe 10, who's been trying to sell matches on the street corner for weeks with exactly 0 success because nobody has money for matches when they can't afford food. There's the baby you don't know its name or even its gender that gets passed around among a group of bigger women, each taking turns nursing it because none of them have quite enough milk alone. These children don't have sleds. They have hypothermia. They don't have servants. They have frostbite. They don't play on the ice. They sleep on it or under makeshift shelters near it or in doorways beside it, and some of them don't wake up. The orphanages are overflowing. You know this because you walked past St. Bride's workhouse last week and saw children being turned away at the door. No room, the matron kept saying, her face hard. No room, no food, can't take any more. The children stood in the snow crying and eventually drifted away to find somewhere else to freeze. Historians still argue whether the Great Frost caused a measurable increase in child mortality or whether the deaths were simply more visible because bodies don't decompose in freezing temperatures. Either way, children were dying in numbers that would have caused outrage if anyone with power had cared enough to be outraged. The wealthy children finish their sledding and move on to building a snowman. Not just piling up snow, they're constructing an elaborate snow sculpture with the servants doing most of the actual work. One servant is rolling a massive snowball for the base, while the children shout directions. Another is fetching coal for eyes, a carrot for the nose. Yes, they're using actual coal and an actual carrot for decorative purposes, while people burn furniture to stay warm and starve for lack of vegetables. The finished snowman is taller than you are, complete with a stolen hat and scarf. The children dance around it, delighted with their creation. The servants stand behind them, shivering, waiting for the next command. You want to tell these children what's happening just outside their bubble of privilege. Want to drag them to the alleyways and show them the frozen corpses? Want to make them understand that their sledding hill is someone else's desperate path to survival. But you don't, because they're children and it's not their fault they were born to wealth any more than it's little Tom's fault he was born to nothing. Still, the anger sits in your chest like a coal that won't burn out. Near the bridge, you see a different kind of child labour. Children, some as young as 7 or 8 working the fair, not as merchants but as necessary cogs in other people's businesses. They're fetching and carrying, tending fires, running messages, doing all the small jobs that keep the fair functioning. They're being paid, which is something. A farthing here, a halfpenny there, occasionally a penny if the employer is feeling generous or the work is particularly hard. It's not enough to live on, but it's enough to not die quite as fast. Some of these children are supporting younger siblings, or sick parents, or just themselves because they've got no one else. One boy, maybe 9 years old, is working as a coal porter, hauling small sacks of coal from the black market stalls to customers. Each sack probably weighs nearly as much as he does, and you watch him struggle across the ice, the weight bending him double. He makes maybe a dozen trips an hour, earning a farthing per trip. That's tuppence on a good day, if his body holds out and he doesn't collapse. Another group of children has formed a sort of informal guide service, offering to show wealthy tourists the best parts of the Frost Fair for a halfpenny. They're actually quite good at it. They know where the entertainment is, where the best food stalls are, which routes across the ice are safest. It's the waterman's old job, but miniaturized and adapted for a new economy. A mainstream historical fact, parish records from the winter of 1684-85 show a significant spike in child deaths, particularly among the poor and orphaned. One parish clerk noted, "Buried this week 12 souls, 8 of them children under the age of 10, most found frozen in diverse places. By evening the wealthy children have gone home to their warm houses and hot dinners. The street children remain because they have nowhere else to go. They cluster together in groups for warmth, sharing what little they have: a scrap of bread, a threadbare blanket, body heat. Some of them will survive the night, some won't. By morning there will be new small bodies to step over, new frozen faces to try not to remember, new proof that childhood in 1685 London is a luxury most can't afford. You head back to Meg's as darkness falls, trying to forget the blonde ringlets and velvet cloaks, the cushioned sleds and hot chocolate, the children who have everything and the children who have nothing, trying not to calculate how many street children could have been fed and sheltered with what those wealthy families spend on a single afternoon's entertainment. But you can't forget. The image stays with you, children playing on ice while children die beneath doorways. Two worlds occupying the same frozen space, close enough to see each other, but separated by a gulf wider than the Thames itself. On February 2nd, you wake up to something you haven't experienced in 6 weeks, the sound of dripping water. Not the slow trickle of melting snow that you've been collecting for drinking water, but actual, dripping, steady, rhythmic, the kind that suggests ice turning liquid without human intervention. You stumble to the window with something approaching excitement, which is dangerous because hope is a luxury you can't afford anymore. But there it is. The icicles hanging from the eaves are weeping, actual drops of water falling from their tips, catching pale morning light as they fall. The temperature has risen above freezing for the first time since Christmas. The thaw spreads across London like a rumour of peace during wartime, cautious, tentative, maybe too good to be true. By mid-morning, the streets are running with meltwater, turning the frozen filth of 6 weeks into mobile filth that flows downhill and collects in icy puddles. It's disgusting. It's wonderful. It's the first sign that winter might actually end instead of continuing forever until everyone in London is a frozen statue. The mood shift is immediate and dramatic. People who've been shuffling around like walking corpses suddenly have energy again. Conversations spring up, spontaneously strangers discussing the weather with genuine enthusiasm instead of the grim resignation that's dominated since January. It's warming. The thaws come. We might actually survive this. The optimism is infectious and probably premature, but nobody cares. Hope, even false hope, feels better than the alternative. On the Thames, the ice begins to sing. That's the only way to describe it creaking, groaning sounds as the frozen surface contracts and expands with the temperature change. It's not breaking, not yet, but it's complaining loudly about the shift. The frost fair vendors exchange nervous glances. Their entire operation depends on solid ice, and solid ice depends on sustained freezing temperatures. You venture onto the river that afternoon because you want to witness this, want to see the beginning of the end of London's frozen nightmare. The ice is still thick, probably 18 inches or more in most places, but there's water on top of it now, meltwater pooling in the low spots, creating treacherous slicks that send more than one person sprawling. The fair is still operating, but there's a new edge of anxiety to it. Vendors are watching the sky, checking the ice, calculating whether to pack up or keep selling. A quirky detail that multiple sources will record: one enterprising merchant starts selling last days of the frost fair certificates for double the normal price, claiming they'll be more valuable as collector's items since the fair is obviously ending. He's either a marketing genius or a shameless opportunist. Probably both. People buy them anyway, wanting proof they were here at this specific moment of transition. The warmth hand. It's barely warmth, maybe just a few degrees above freezing makes everything feel possible again. You notice people making plans, talking about the future in a way they haven't for weeks. When the barges can run again, once the mills can ship flour, after things return to normal, the assumption being that normal is coming back, that this isn't the new permanent state of existence. You want to believe it too. You catch yourself planning, fantasizing about a time when water runs freely from conduits, when bread costs what it used to, when you don't have to decide which piece of furniture to burn each day. The future, which has been so impossible to imagine, suddenly snaps back into focus. You might actually make it through this. For 3 days, the thaw continues. The ice thins noticeably. Large cracks appear near the banks, where the current is strongest. Watermen start talking about when, not if, they'll be able to work again. One optimistic soul even drags his wherry to the river's edge, preparing for the moment the ice breaks enough to launch. The mood is almost festive. We survived. We're going to be okay. The worst is over. Then, on February 5th, the temperature drops again. Not gradually. Not a gentle return to cold. The thermometer plummets like a stone thrown into a well, and by evening it's colder than it's been all winter. The meltwater on the streets freezes solid, creating a layer of fresh ice over old ice, smooth and treacherous. The puddles turn to glass. The dripping from the eaves stops mid-drip, leaving frozen tears hanging in the air. On the Thames, The ice that was starting to fracture seals itself again with sounds like gunshots. The cracks that were widening snap shut. The water that was pooling on the surface freezes into a new layer, making the ice thicker than before. The frost fair, which was preparing to close, gets an unwelcome reprieve. The psychological impact is devastating. You watch it happen to people around you, with hope draining from their faces like blood from a wound, replaced by something worse than the despair they felt in January. In January, they didn't know how bad it could get. Now they do. They'd climbed part way out of the pit, seen daylight, and then been shoved back down. The fall hurts more the second time. Historians still argue whether the brief February thaw made the overall crisis worse by providing false hope, or whether it actually helped by giving people a few days of relief and renewed energy. The people who lived through it didn't have the luxury of academic debate. They just had to endure. The deaths increase. By tell. You notice it in the number of bodies collected by the parish carts each morning. Something about the temperature fluctuation seems to have broken people's remaining resistance. Or maybe it was the hope. Maybe believing things were getting better and then having that belief shattered was the final straw for bodies and minds already stretched beyond their limits. Little Tom, the 6-year-old who slept in a barrel near the fishmongers, doesn't wake up after the temperature drops again. You find him yourself, curled up inside his barrel, eyes half open, frozen solid. He'd survived 6 weeks of the worst winter in living memory, made it through the coldest parts of January, and then died when he'd just started to believe he might live. The vendors who'd started packing up their frost fair stalls unpack again, resignation on their faces. The waterman who'd dragged his wherry to the river's edge drags it back to storage. The certificates celebrating the last days of the frost fair become unintentional jokes. The merchant who sold them has disappeared, probably embarrassed, possibly just frozen somewhere. You burn your trunk that night? You'd been saving it, hoping you wouldn't need to, believing the warmth would return and you could keep this one last piece of furniture. But the false thaw broke something in you, made you realize that hope is dangerous, that planning for a better future is a fantasy you can't afford. Better to burn what you have now and survive today. Tomorrow can take care of itself, if tomorrow even comes. The oak burns hot and long, giving you several hours of genuine warmth. You sit as close to the small fire as safety allows, letting the heat soak into your bones, and try not to think about what you'll burn next week when the trunk is gone and the cold is still here, and spring remains a distant, possibly mythical concept. Outside, the renewed frost grips London with vindictive intensity, as if punishing the city for daring to hope. The real thaw, when it finally comes on February 10th, doesn't announce itself with gentle warmth. It arrives with a sound like artillery, fire massive cracks shooting through the ice with reports that echo off both banks of the Thames. You're on the ice when it happens, because of course you are, because the universe has a sense of humour about these things. The first crack opens maybe 30 yards from where you're standing, a dark line splitting the white surface with terrifying speed. It's not a gradual, fracturite, instantaneous, like someone drew a knife across the ice in one violent motion. Water, black and churning, immediately wells up through the gap. The ice on either side of the crack shifts, groans, rises slightly as pressure redistributes. People start screaming, and not panicked screaming, yet more like surprise screaming, the sound of people realizing that the solid ground they trusted has become treacherous. The frost fair, which has existed for 6 weeks as a semi-permanent fixture, suddenly becomes a death trap with a ticking clock. "Get off the ice!" someone shouts, son of the waterman, you think, someone who actually understands rivers and ice and what happens when winter loses its grip. "Everyone off! Now!" The evacuation is chaos attempting to organize itself. Vendors start grabbing their most valuable goods, trying to salvage something before abandoning their stalls. Customers drop whatever they were buying and run for the banks. The printing press. Tent Croom's operation that's been producing certificates for weeks is already being dismantled, workers frantically breaking down the press and loading it onto a sledge. You run, not towards Southwark, which would be logical, but toward a cluster of people who seemed frozen with fear near one of the ox roasting stations. Because apparently, even when the ice is literally breaking beneath your feet, you're still stupid enough to try helping strangers. The group includes a woman with 2 small children, an elderly man who's moving too slowly, and a merchant who's trying to carry a crate of goods that's clearly too heavy. The woman is crying, tugging at her children's hands, trying to get them to move faster. The children, because children have no sense of danger, are fascinated by the cracking ice. "Leave the crate," you shout at the merchant. "It's worth £20. It's worth nothing if you're dead." He drops it anyway when another crack opens, this one closer, maybe 10 yards away. The sound is like a tree splitting in half that distinctive crack, followed by groaning, settling sounds as tons of ice shift position. Through the new gap, you can see the Thames flowing underneath, dark and fast and absolutely not interested in supporting human weight. You grab the elderly man's arm and start hauling him toward the Southwark bank. He's surprisingly light malnutrition will do that, but also surprisingly slow. His feet shuffle across the ice like he's forgotten how walking works. Behind you, the woman is carrying one child and dragging the other, and the merchant has abandoned his goods and is helping by pushing the old man from behind. The ice beneath your feet feels different now, less solid. There's a flexing quality to it, like you're walking on a wooden plank that's bending under your weight. Water is seeping up through cracks you can't even see, making the surface slick and treacherous. Every step might be the one that sends you through. A quirky detail that will haunt witnesses for years. One of the ox roasting stations, the massive brazier, the spit, the partially roasted ox still on it, goes through the ice in a single catastrophic collapse. The ice underneath, weakened by weeks of heat from the fire, simply gives way. The entire operation fire, meat, cooking equipment drops into the Thames in a hissing, steaming chaos. The man who was tending it jumps clear at the last second, landing on more stable ice and scrambling away on his hands and knees. More cracks appear, spiderwebbing across the Thames in patterns that would be beautiful if they weren't terrifying. The fair is disintegrating in real time. Tents collapse as the ice beneath them shifts. Stalls tip over, spilling goods onto the breaking surface. A sled loaded with barrels slides sideways into a widening crack, the barrels tumbling into the water one by one like coins into a well. You make it to the bank, actual solid ground that won't betray you, and help the old man up the icy slope. The woman and her children are right behind you, the merchant bringing up the rear. All of you collapse on the shore, breathing hard, watching the Thames reclaim itself. Not everyone makes it off. You see a man you don't know his name, just recognize him as one of the gambling den operators. Misjudge a jump across a crack. He lands on ice that can't support his weight, and it gives way with a sound like breaking glass. He goes under, surfaces once with a gasp that you can hear from shore, reaches for the edge of solid ice, and then the current takes him. Under the ice, downstream, gone. The people around him can only watch, helpless. A horse goes through near London Bridge, thrashing and screaming in a way that horses shouldn't be able to scream. Its rider had already dismounted and made it to safety, but the horse, spooked and confused, had bolted in the wrong direction. You watch someone try to reach it with a rope, watch the ice crack under the would-be rescuer's feet, watch everyone scramble back because a dead horse is tragic but not worth dying for. Historians still argue about the exact number of casualties when the Thames ice broke, but contemporary accounts mention several drowned and divers lost to the waters. The real number was probably higher, because the poor who drowned without witnesses didn't make it into official records. The breakup continues throughout the day and into the night. You watch from the Southwark bank as the frost fair tears itself apart. Massive ice floes, some the size of houses, break free and drift downstream. They collide with each other, with ships still locked in ice, with the bridge itself creating a slow-motion demolition that sounds like continuous thunder. The printing press makes it off. You see Croom and his workers hauling it to shore on a sledge, looking exhausted but triumphant. Some of his certificates probably went into the Thames, but he saved the press itself, and that's what matters. That press will print new things, tell new stories, including probably a pamphlet about the dramatic end of the Frost Fair. Other vendors aren't so lucky. You watch a tent full of goods, food, clothes, various merchandise seep into the water as the ice beneath it fractures. The owner stands on shore, watching his livelihood disappear into the Thames, his face blank with shock. 6 weeks of work, of risk, of profits made on the ice, all gone in 30 seconds. By nightfall, the Thames is a churning mass of ice floes and black water, impassable and deadly. The Frost Fair is gone like it never existed, leaving only debris on the banks and stories in people's memories. The river is flowing again, which means watermen can work, barges can run, London can begin to return to normal. But normal is going to take a while. The bodies start appearing 3 days after the ice breaks. Not all at once, that would almost be merciful. A single day of horror you could process and move past. Instead, they surface gradually over the course of 2 weeks, each discovery a fresh reminder of what the winter cost. The first one you hear about is pulled from the river near Blackfriars. A waterman working for the first time in 6 weeks snags something with his oar that isn't debris. It's a woman, maybe 30 years old, still wearing the remains of a blue dress. She'd been trapped under the ice since the thaw began, and the current finally released her. The waterman rows her to shore, reports it to the parish, and gets back to work because he's lost 6 weeks of wages and can't afford to let sentiment interfere with earning. Within a week, they've pulled 12 bodies from the Thames. Men, women, 1 child. Some are people who went through the ice when it broke. Recognize the gambling den operator by his distinctive coat, though his face is too bloated to identify. Others are mysteries. How long were they in the water? Did they fall through during the Frost Fair or before? Were they alive when they hit the water, or already dead from cold or starvation and simply dumped into the convenient frozen river? The parishes are trying to keep count, trying to document who died and how, but it's chaos. Bodies keep appearing in unexpected places, washed up on the banks, caught in the bridge starlings, floating in the pools where the current is slow. The clerks can't keep up. The grave diggers are overwhelmed. London is conducting a month's delayed funeral for victims of a winter that's still extracting its final tribute. A quirky and grim detail, one body recovered from the Thames still had a Frost Fair souvenir certificate in his pocket, soggy but legible. John Hammond, printed on January 15th, certified that he had walked upon the frozen river. He bought proof of his survival and then didn't survive. The certificate was returned to his widow along with his few other possessions. But the river deaths are only part of the accounting. The other bodies, the ones that never made it to the waterari, being discovered as neighbours check on people they haven't seen since the worst of the cold, as landlords enter rooms where rent hasn't been paid, as the smell of decomposition begins to compete with the smell of thaw. You hear about entire families found dead in their homes. Not murdered, not diseased, just frozen and starved. A man, his wife, and 3 children in Bermondsey huddled together in bed under every scrap of fabric they owned, having burned every stick of furniture including the bed frame, with nothing left to burn and no strength left to search for food. The parish collector who found them said they looked peaceful, like they'd simply gone to sleep. Maybe they had. Maybe that's mercy. An elderly couple in Southwark, dead in their chairs by a cold hearth. They'd apparently made a pact to find this out from a neighbour who heard them discussing it, that if one died, the other would follow. The neighbour isn't sure which one went first, but they were found holding hands across the space between their chairs, which is somehow both romantic and heartbreaking. Historians still argue whether the official death toll from the great Frostusually cited as 2030 Yeomanrand for Londoners remotely accurate, or whether it's a massive undercount. The parish records are incomplete, biased toward recording deaths of people who mattered: property owners, guild members, anyone with money, and generally bad at tracking the poor, who make up most of the casualties. The city is conducting a gruesome census. Parish clerks go door to door in the poorest areas, knocking, waiting, entering when there's no answer. Sometimes they find living people, weak and sick, but alive. Sometimes they find corpses. Sometimes they find homes that have been abandoned, the residents fled or dead elsewhere, or simply vanished into London's anonymous masses. You help with one of these searches in your own building. Meg asks you to check on a tenant in the cellar room, an old man named Peter who hasn't been seen in over a week. You knock. No answer. You try the door unlocked, which is concerning. Inside, the room is dark and cold and smells like death, which prepares you for what you find, but doesn't make it easier. Peter is in bed, or what used to be a bed before he burned the frame. He's lying on the mattress on the floor, covered with a single thin blanket, eyes closed, skin waxy and grey. Dead. Has been for days, maybe a week. The room is completely empty except for the mattress and Peter's body. He'd burned everything: furniture, his spare clothes, even what looks like parts of the floor itself, tearing up boards to feed a fire that's long since gone cold. You report it to Meg, who reports it to the parish. They collect Peter that afternoon, adding him to the count. One more casualty. One more name in the ledger, if they even record his name. Peter wasn't important. No family, no property, no money. Just an old man who froze to death alone in a cellar while the city carried on above him. The mental toll of all this death is harder to quantify than the body count. You see it in people's face, a haunted look, a flinching away from locked doors and silent rooms. Everyone has lost someone. Not necessarily people they knew well, but neighbours, acquaintances, the familiar faces that make a community feel alive. London feels emptier now, hollowed out, like someone removed a percentage of the population and left gaps that won't be filled. The missing are perhaps worse than the confirmed dead. Families searching for members who disappeared during the worst of the winter. Was he one of the bodies pulled from the Thames? Did she freeze in an alleyway somewhere and get carted away unidentified? Did they leave London entirely, fleeing to somewhere warmer, and just never sent word? The not knowing extends the grief indefinitely. A mainstream historical fact, the Great Frost of 68-485, killed an estimated 2,300 people in London alone, though the true number was likely much higher. Across England, thousands more died from cold, starvation, and related causes during what was one of the coldest winters on record. By late February, the counting is mostly done, though bodies will continue appearing for months as the last of the ice melts and reveals what it's been hiding. The final toll is grim, but not surprising to anyone who lived through it. You knew people were dying. You stepped over corpses in the street. You watched children freeze in doorways. The official numbers just confirm what you already knew. The winter of 1684-85 killed London by the hundreds. But it didn't kill you. You're still here, still alive, having burned all your furniture and most of your possessions, having gone hungry and cold and desperate, having witnessed horrors that will probably feature in your nightmares for years. But alive. That has to count for something. By early March, London is attempting something between recovery and denial. The Thames flows freely now, busy with the water traffic that defines the city's pulse. Barges bring flour from upstream mills. Coal arrives from Newcastle in quantities that would have seemed miraculous in January. The conduits run clear and cold, free water for anyone who wants it. The basic machinery of urban life has restarted, and people are trying very hard to pretend that the past 3 months were an aberration rather than a revelation. But you can't unsee what you've seen. Can't forget the bodies in the alleyways, the children who didn't make it, the slow grinding desperation of watching civilization fray at the edges. The Great Frost has left marks that won't fade with the ice. Your corner of Meg's attic looks different now, emptier. You've been living minimally before, but now you're down to the absolute essentials. A straw mattress on the floor, your trunk which you miraculously didn't burn, the clothes on your back and one spare set. Everything else, the furniture, the little comforts that made the space feel like yours, went into fires that brought you hours of warmth and kept you alive. The room echoes now when you walk across it. Your body tells its own story. You've lost weight you couldn't afford to lose, and your clothes hang loose in ways that would be comical if they weren't concerning. Your fingers still ache from the frostbite. Blackwell was right, they did recover, but they'll never quite feel normal again. Cold days make them throb, a permanent reminder of January's grip. You suspect you'll carry that ache for the rest of your life, however long that turns out to be. The city is rebuilding, but slowly, haltingly, with the caution of people who've learned that stability is temporary. Merchants are restocking their shops. Bakeries are producing bread at almost normal quantities, though prices remain higher than they should be because profiteering didn't end with the thaw. The wealthy are already romanticizing the frost fair in their dinner party conversations, turning catastrophe into colourful anecdote. Oh yes, I attended the most delightful ice party. Did you purchase one of those marvellous certificates they're already forgetting or choosing to remember it wrong? The poor aren't forgetting, can't forget. Every missing neighbour, every frozen child, every body pulled from the Thames is a memory that won't be softened by time or distance. You know the names of people who died. You know which families lost everyone. You know which children are now orphans, which elderly are now alone. The Great Frost didn't just kill. People it tore holes in the fabric of community that will take years, maybe generations, to mend. A quirky detail that shows up in parish records from March 1685, several churches held Thanksgiving services for deliverance from the Great Frost, and attendance was actually lower than normal. The clerks noted this, with confusion surely. People should be grateful to have survived. But perhaps gratitude was complicated by grief. Hard to thank God for your survival when so many others didn't survive. Work has resumed, which is both relief and burden. You're back to your normal employment. Such as it is, irregular and underpaid, but something. The rhythm of ordinary life feels strange after weeks of survival-focused existence. Worrying about rent and food prices and normal problems seems almost trivial after worrying about freezing to death, but the bills come due regardless of what you've survived. You see the other survivors around Southwark, and there's an unspoken recognition between you. A nod, a glance, nothing dramatic. But you know which ones burned their furniture, which ones went hungry, which ones made it through by margins so thin they're still surprised to be breathing. There's a club you didn't want to join, and membership is marked by hollow cheeks and haunted eyes and fingers that ache when it's cold. The Thames itself seems different, though you know that's probably your imagination. It's the same river, flowing the same path. It's flowed for millennia. But you can't look at it without remembering it frozen, without seeing the ghost of the frost fair, without thinking about the bodies it held and eventually released. The watermen have returned to their boats calling for passengers just like always, but some of them, the ones who turned to crime on the ice, who robbed and threatened in their desperation, won't quite meet your eyes. Historians still argue whether the Great Frost of 1684-85 was the coldest winter in English history or merely the best documented severe winter of the century. The distinction matters to academics. To you, to everyone who lived through it, the question is meaningless. It was cold enough to freeze the Thames solid, cold enough to kill hundreds, maybe thousands, cold enough to reveal exactly how fragile civilization is when the temperature drops far enough. A mainstream historical fact, the winter of 1684-85 was part of the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that affected Europe from roughly the 14th to the 19th century. The Thames would freeze several more times in coming decades, but never again would Londoners build quite such an elaborate fair on the ice. Spring is coming, finally actually coming. You can smell it on the warmer winds, see it in the buds appearing on the few trees that survived winter. The days are getting longer, the sun stronger, the cold losing its grip hour by hour. Soon there will be flowers, green things, warmth that doesn't require burning your possessions. The Great Frost is becoming past tense, a thing that happened rather than a thing that's happening. But you're changed. Everyone who survived is changed. You understand now, in a way you didn't before, how thin the margin is between survival and death, how quickly normal can become catastrophe, how little separates the fed from the starving, the warm from the frozen, the living from the dead. You've survived what witnesses are already calling the worst winter in living memory. You walked on the frozen Thames, witnessed the frost fair, stepped over corpses, burned your furniture, went hungry and cold and desperate, and came out the other side. Damaged, diminished, but alive. That has to count for something. It has to. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, let the story of the Great Frost fade gently into memory, just as it did for the survivors all those centuries ago. The ice melted, the Thames flowed again, and London, battered but breathing, carried on. You don't need to hold on to the cold anymore, or the hunger, or the fear. Those things belong to January 1685, to a winter that's long past, to people who faced the impossible and survived it through sheer stubborn endurance. Let your breath slow, your body warm, your mind drift away from frozen rivers and desperate choices. The story is complete now. You've walked through all of it from the first morning when the chamber pot froze solid, through the Frost Fair's strange carnival, past the bodies and the hunger and the breaking ice, all the way to the slow thaw and the quiet reckoning that followed. The survivors went on with their lives, rebuilt what they could, mourned what they'd lost, and gradually, over months and years, the sharp edges of the memory softened into something they could live with. The Great Frost became a story to tell, a thing they'd endured, a winter that tested them and found some of them strong enough to continue. And now you can rest, knowing their story has been told, knowing you've walked beside them through the coldest months London ever knew, knowing that even the worst winters eventually end, that ice always melts, that spring always returns. The Thames flows on, 300 years later, carrying different boats, different dreams, different lives, but still the same river that froze and thawed and taught London just how fragile and how resilient it truly was. Sleep well, let the ice melt from your dreams, and wake to your own warm spring morning.